My name is Maya. I am 32 years old and work as a forensic accountant. After my grandparents died in a sudden car crash, the lawyer called our family in to read the will. My parents, Pastor Thomas and First Lady Denise, sat in the office with smug smiles expecting to inherit a $150 million empire. But when the lawyer announced that I was the sole heir to every penny, they erupted in rage, demanding I hand everything over immediately. The next day, they came to evict me from my grandparents' riverside villa by force, but froze in terror when they saw who was standing beside me. My mother started screaming, but I smiled and hung up. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Maryland, my family was the picture of spiritual perfection to outsiders. But inside our home, emotional manipulation and greed permeated every corner. The oak doors of Evelyn Vance's law office closed with a solid thud. My grandparents, Silas and Ruby, had built a massive logistics and commercial real estate empire from absolutely nothing. Grandpa Silas started with one delivery truck in the 70s, driving 18 hours a day. Grandma Ruby managed the books late at night. Over decades, they built a massive fleet of freight trucks and bought up industrial warehouses. They were old money. Sitting directly across from me at the mahogany conference table were my parents, Pastor Thomas, and First Lady Denise. My father wore a custom Armani suit that cost more than most of his congregation made in a month. He adjusted his heavy gold Rolex, checking the time impatiently. Beside him, my mother clutched a genuine Hermes bag, her perfectly styled hair framing a face of rehearsed mourning. They were the public leaders of a Maryland megachurch, actively using church funds for an absurd luxury lifestyle. Next to them sat my younger sister Chloe, the undeniable golden child, and her husband Darius. Darius leaned back, checking his failing cryptocurrency portfolios on his phone. Evelyn adjusted her reading glasses. She had been my grandfather's attorney for 30 years and despised my father. The room fell silent. She began reading the legal preambles, and I could see my father tapping his polished Italian leather shoes against the floor. He was ready for the big reveal. He had spent the last 5 years ignoring my grandparents entirely, except for posing for family holiday photos to project a wholesome image to his followers. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded in my lap. As a forensic accountant, I track hidden offshore accounts to find where criminals hide stolen funds. Today, that professional training was my shield. Evelyn turned the parchment page. I hereby revoke all prior wills, she read, her voice ringing with absolute authority. I leave my entire estate, including all real property, corporate holdings, logistics, contracts, trusts, and liquid assets currently valued at approximately $150 million, entirely and exclusively to my granddaughter Maya. The silence that followed was absolute. My father stopped tapping his foot. My mother dropped her hand from her face, and her fake expression of grief vanished entirely, replaced by a mask of sheer horror. Chloe dropped her phone onto the mahogany table. Darius sat up straight, his eyes wide with utter shock. "Excuse me," my father finally choked out, his booming preacher voice cracking. Evelyn looked at him calmly. "You heard correctly, Thomas," she said firmly. "The entire estate is left to Maya. You and Denise are explicitly excluded from this will." Silas and Ruby made their intentions incredibly clear in the final codicil they signed 3 months ago. My father stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair crashed loudly onto the floor. "That is impossible," he roared, the veins in his neck bulging. "I am his only son. I am the rightful patriarch of this family." "Do you have any idea who I am, Evelyn? I am Pastor Thomas. I lead a congregation of 10,000 people. I cannot be cut out of my own father's will. It will ruin my image. The board of elders will ask questions. We need that money." My mother joined in, her voice trembling with intense rage. She pointed a perfectly manicured nail at me. "You manipulated them," she shrieked. "You moved into their riverside house and poisoned their frail minds against us. You took advantage of 2 sick elderly people because you have always been jealous of your father's massive success." I looked my father directly in the eyes. My voice was calm and entirely empty of the warmth he demanded. I did not manipulate anyone, I said clearly. I simply showed up. I sat in the intensive care unit for 72 hours straight managing his paperwork while you and Mom were flying first class to Dubai on the church's dime, posting photos of your luxury desert safari. You claimed you were on a crucial spiritual retreat. My father opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. And when Grandma Ruby needed round-the-clock, Care Mother refused, saying her duties as First Lady were far too important to be interrupted by changing bedpans. So I moved in. I managed their daily care and their complex finances when their health began to fail. I did it out of deep love while my parents did absolutely nothing but wait for them to die. You abandoned them, Dad, for your fake prosperity gospel and designer suits. They saw right through your incredible hypocrisy. They knew exactly who you were and made absolute certain their lifetime legacy would not be liquidated to pay off your dirty secrets. My father turned a dangerous shade of purple, slamming his fists down on the mahogany table. You listen to me, you arrogant little girl, he hissed, leaning over the table toward me. You are going to sign a legal renunciation of this will right this second. You are going to step aside and let the real leader of this family handle the business. You are just a glorified bookkeeper. You do not have the mental capacity to manage a massive logistics empire. I smiled a cold smile. I am a certified forensic accountant, Dad. I investigate complex financial crimes for a living. I am quite certain I can handle Grandpa's real estate portfolio. What I think you are actually terrified about is that you cannot use this new money to aggressively cover up whatever massive financial hole you have currently dug for yourself at your megachurch. That was when my sister Chloe slammed her hands on the table. You are so incredibly selfish, Maya, she yelled. Darius and I desperately need that money right now. We have massive investments tied up, and we are facing a devastating margin call. We are family, and you are robbing us. Darius stood up, puffing out his chest to try and physically intimidate me. Look, Maya, he said, his tone shifting to a fake negotiating voice. Let us be extremely reasonable here. You do not need $150 million. I have major cryptocurrency portfolios that are just waiting to completely rebound. We are talking about true generational wealth here. If you immediately sign the estate over to the family, I can invest it properly for all of us. I can easily double it in a single year. We need capital right now, Maya. We are drowning in severe debt because of the recent market crash. If we do not get a major injection of cash by the end of this week, the bank is going to repossess my truck and foreclose on our expensive house. You owe us this money. I looked at Darius, then at my sister, and finally at my enraged parents. Family, I said softly, stands by you when things get hard. You are just a collection of strangers waiting for a payout. My father pointed a trembling finger at my face. You mark my words, Maya, he growled, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You will not survive a single week in that riverside house. I will make your life a living hell. I will tie this up in court for decades if I have to. You are making a very powerful enemy today. I stood up from my chair, straightened my skirt, and picked up my bag. I am not afraid of you, Thomas, I replied, using his first name for the first time in my life. And considering what I know about your accounting practices at the church, you really should not be making threats to a financial investigator. Have a blessed day. I reached the heavy oak door of the conference room and wrapped my hand around the brass handle. Before I could turn it, the frantic clicking of high heels echoed against the polished hardwood floor. My mother rushed forward and slammed her hand flat against the wood paneling, physically blocking my exit. It was a terrifyingly quick psychological transformation. 1 second she was a screaming banshee demanding my submission, and the next she was First Lady Denise, the compassionate matriarch of our Maryland congregation. She took a deep, dramatic breath, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in her expensive designer silk blouse. Maya, sweetheart. Wait, she cooed, her voice suddenly soft and dripping with artificial honey. Let us just take a collective breath here. Emotions are running incredibly high right now, and we are all completely overwhelmed by the sudden tragic loss of your beloved grandparents. We are a Christian family. We should not be raising our voices at each other in a cold legal office like common enemies. I let go of the brass door handle and took a deliberate step back, crossing my arms defensively over my chest. I watched her calculated dramatic performance with completely detached clinical interest, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she so desperately craved from me. My mother was an absolute master of emotional whiplash. She would break you down with vicious, targeted insults, and then immediately pivot to playing the loving savior who was only acting out of deep concern for your eternal soul. I had spent years in intensive therapy, unlearning the psychological damage her tactics had caused. Now looking closely at her desperate routine as an independent grown woman, it just looked incredibly pathetic and transparent. "Listen to me, my beautiful, highly capable daughter," she continued, reaching out an overly manicured hand, attempting to softly stroke my rigid arm. I stepped back again, refusing to let her touch me. She frowned slightly, but forced herself to maintain her sickly sweet smile. "We are just terribly, deeply worried about your future, Maya. Inheriting a complicated corporate empire of this massive, overwhelming magnitude is not a divine blessing. It is a terrifying financial burden. The endless, complicated federal taxes, the complex hidden corporate liabilities, the constant grueling legal meetings with ruthless, aggressive corporate executives. It will completely destroy your mental health, and as your loving mother, I simply cannot stand by and watch my own flesh and blood crumble under that kind of immense, unnatural pressure. Your grandfather clearly made this extremely rash decision, while his fragile, aging mind was heavily clouded by the strong pain medication the hospice nurses were constantly giving him." I stared at her without blinking a single time. Grandma and Grandpa were completely lucid and entirely in control of their mental faculties until their very last breath. I stated flatly, my voice devoid of any emotion. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew exactly why they specifically chose me to protect this estate. My mother sighed a heavy theatrical sigh and opened her fake Hermes bag. She pulled out a thick stapled document printed on premium watermarked legal paper. She smoothed the document out right next to Evelyn. "I brought this just in case," my mother said, tapping her fingernail against the title. "It is a standard power of attorney document. It simply grants your father and Darius the legal right to manage the financial assets of the estate on your behalf." My father nodded solemnly, adjusting his custom suit jacket. "Your mother is entirely right, Maya," he said, his tone returning to the low, soothing baritone he used during his Sunday sermons. "The modern commercial business world is a highly brutal and entirely unforgiving arena. It is completely full of ruthless corporate sharks who will gladly tear a young, inexperienced, naive woman to pieces without a second thought. You absolutely need a strong protective shield. You need capable men who know how to expertly navigate high-stakes corporate finance." He gestured grandly toward my brother-in-law. "Darius is a financial visionary," my father declared with absolute conviction. "He is a proven master of cryptocurrency and decentralized finance. He can take your grandfather's outdated logistics company and completely modernize it." He walked confidently over to the edge of the mahogany table, crossing his arms to look bigger. "Look, Maya, I have been aggressively studying the global financial markets for years," Darius said, using his best Wall Street broker voice. "The commercial real estate your grandfather owned is severely underutilized. If we rapidly liquidate the physical assets and pivot heavily into blockchain technology and high-yield crypto staking, we can easily generate a 40% annual return on investment. You just sign that paper, and I will handle the immense stress of making us all billionaires." As he spoke, my forensic accountant brain automatically began running a complete real-time background check on everything in my visual field. I looked critically at Darius. He was wearing a shiny gold Rolex, but the smooth sweep of the second hand was slightly off, indicating it was a high-quality fake purchased online. He had driven to the law office today in a pristine white Mercedes G-Wagon. I knew for an absolute verified fact that specific vehicle was leased under a predatory high-interest auto loan because I had clearly seen the urgent late finance company correspondence accidentally mailed to the church administrative office last month. Then I shifted my gaze to my mother. The dark green Hermes Birkin bag she was carrying had leather stitching that was a millimeter too wide. They were absolutely drowning in a suffocating ocean of debt to keep up their prosperity gospel facade. You seriously want to single-handedly manage a $150 million commercial logistics empire? I asked, my voice cutting sharply through the thick, heavy tension in the room like a cold surgical scalpel. I walked slowly and deliberately back to the long mahogany conference table. I looked directly and intensely into his eyes and watched his confident, arrogant smile instantly falter and fade away under my cold, unrelenting stare. Your entire cryptocurrency portfolio dropped 62% last quarter, Darius, I said, clearly enunciating every single word so there could be no misunderstanding. You completely foolishly leveraged your primary family residence to secretly buy highly volatile internet meme coins, and when the digital market inevitably crashed, you took out a high-interest predatory payday loan just to cover your basic monthly mortgage payment. You are currently 3 full months behind on your luxury car lease. If you do not make a massive payment by next Tuesday morning, the bank is going to aggressively repossess that white G-Wagon right out of your suburban driveway while the neighbors watch. My younger sister Chloe gasped loudly and aggressively grabbed his arm, looking at him in total shocked, horrified disbelief. He had obviously been lying to his own wife about their disastrous finances too. Then I turned my undivided attention to my mother, who was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "And you, Mom?" I continued, pointing directly at her counterfeit handbag. "You have the audacity to carry a fake Birkin bag to a legal meeting about a multi-million-dollar inheritance. You and Dad have secretly taken out 3 separate high-interest loans against the primary church property, just to maintain your exclusive country club memberships. You and Dad do not possess any actual legitimate business acumen. What you actually have is a massive, completely uncontrollable spending addiction. The only reason you desperately want me to sign this power of attorney is so you can immediately liquidate Grandpa's hard-earned, tangible assets and use the cash to pay off the dangerous criminal syndicates and shady underground creditors you currently owe massive amounts of money to. I will absolutely not ever let you destroy his magnificent lifelong legacy just to continually fund your fake, fraudulent prosperity gospel lifestyle." My mother stumbled backward a few steps, as if I had physically slapped her across the face. My father stood completely frozen, his jaw clamped tight with silent, explosive fury, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. I reached across the smooth wood and picked up the power of attorney document from the table. I did not simply tear it in half. Instead, I walked calmly and purposefully over to the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sitting quietly in the corner of Evelyn's office. I reached out and flipped the main power switch on. The large machine hummed to life with a low, intimidating growl. I slowly fed the thick stack of premium watermarked legal paper directly into the ravenous slot, maintaining direct, unblinking eye contact with my enraged father the entire time. The loud shredder ground their desperate backup plan into hundreds of meaningless, thin white ribbons, dropping them into the waste bin below. I turned the machine off. The loud mechanical hum died down, and the executive office plunged back into a heavy, suffocating silence. For a long, tense moment, nobody dared to breathe or make a single sudden movement. Then my father finally snapped, losing his carefully constructed pastoral composure. He slammed his heavy fist down onto the mahogany table with terrifying, violent force, violently rattling the crystal water glasses and causing Evelyn to jump in her seat. "You will not survive a single week in that Riverside house, little girl," he vowed, his deep voice shaking with raw, unfiltered hatred and desperation. "Have a blessed day," I replied with a hollow smile, turned on my heel, grabbed my heavy coat from the rack, and finally walked out the tall, heavy oak door, leaving them entirely alone with their spectacular, catastrophic failure. I walked out of the building and spent the rest of the weekend fortifying my grandparents' Riverside estate. By Sunday morning, the heavy Maryland humidity had settled over the quiet river outside my window. I was sitting in my grandfather's old leather armchair, drinking bitter black coffee, when my phone began to buzz violently against the thick glass of the coffee table. It was not just one single message. It was a relentless, continuous flood of rapid notifications vibrating so intensely that the phone nearly slid off the table. I picked up the device and watched the bright screen light up with dozens of incoming text messages from numbers I instantly recognized. They were the senior elders, prominent deacons, and wealthy donors of my father's massive megachurch. Deacon Miller sent a long message saying he was actively praying for my wicked, corrupted soul. Sister Jenkins texted that my overwhelming greed was a direct insult to the Lord, and that I needed to return the stolen inheritance to my righteous parents before the devil consumed my life completely. Another senior elder falsely accused me of severe elder abuse, claiming I had maliciously isolated my poor, vulnerable grandparents in their final days to aggressively manipulate their fragile, failing minds. The messages kept pouring in, each one more hateful and venomous than the last. They called me a prodigal thief, a disgrace to the family name, and a greedy opportunist who had exploited two dying people. I did not need to be physically sitting in the front pew of the massive air-conditioned sanctuary to know exactly what was currently happening. My father was currently standing behind his expensive clear acrylic pulpit, broadcasting a perfectly calculated theatrical sermon to 10,000 devoted followers. He was expertly playing the ultimate tragic victim. I opened the church's high-definition livestream on my laptop and watched the performance unfold. Sure enough, there was Pastor Thomas looking utterly heartbroken, wiping a single, perfectly timed tear from his cheek with a custom monogrammed silk handkerchief. His booming baritone voice echoed through the massive auditorium filled with artificial sorrow. My mother, First Lady Denise, sat in the very front row wearing a somber dark dress, nodding solemnly and dabbing her completely dry eyes. My father was loudly proclaiming to the silent, captivated audience that a dark, deceptive spirit of greed had maliciously overtaken his own flesh and blood. He spun a highly tragic, entirely fictional tale of how I had supposedly coerced Silas and Ruby, taking cruel advantage of their failing memories and physical weakness to completely rewrite the historic family legacy. He painted himself as the grieving, loving father who was willing to forgive his wayward daughter if she would only return the stolen generational wealth to the church where it truly belonged. He expertly riled up the massive congregation, turning 10,000 faithful people into a personal angry mob directed entirely at me. He was weaponizing his massive religious platform to publicly destroy my reputation and force me into absolute submission. I sat alone in the quiet riverside villa, watching the live video feed. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the familiar childhood sting of painful rejection, or the crushing, suffocating weight of their massive public humiliation. That vulnerable little girl who desperately craved their conditional approval and feared their religious judgment was long gone. In her place was a seasoned, cold-blooded forensic accountant who knew exactly how the criminal mind worked. I knew from years of intense corporate investigations that when guilty people scream incredibly loudly about someone else's alleged crimes, they are almost always desperately trying to distract the public from their own massive misdeeds. My parents were aggressively projecting their own hidden financial sins directly onto me. They needed a convenient scapegoat to explain to the elders why the church was suddenly struggling to pay its basic operational bills. I calmly closed the video stream, terminating my father's fake tears, and opened my highly encrypted forensic accounting software. My grandfather Silas had been a meticulous, incredibly thorough record keeper, and he had left me full, unrestricted administrative access to the family trust servers, which still had deep historical digital ties to the early church building funds. I cracked my knuckles and began running a highly targeted, complex data trace on the church's primary tithe and offering accounts. I knew my parents' extravagant spending habits, and more importantly, I knew exactly how to follow a digital money trail through layers of corporate deception. For the next 3 uninterrupted hours, the only sound in the large, quiet house was the rapid, aggressive clicking of my mechanical keyboard. I pulled massive files of public tax filings, matched them meticulously against the county property records, and ran a complex proprietary algorithm to track the massive weekly cash donations my father collected from his loyal congregation. What I found hiding beneath the surface was completely staggering and highly illegal. My father had not just been skimming a little bit of cash off the top to pay for his tailored Italian suits and luxury desert vacations. He had established a highly sophisticated complex network of dummy corporations, secretly registered under my mother and my sister Chloe's maiden names. Millions of dollars in untaxed charitable donations were being systematically and quietly funneled out of the legitimate church building fund and directly into invisible offshore shell companies. But the most glaring, terrifying red flag was not the offshore accounts. It was the massive outgoing wire transfers to a high-risk commercial real estate development firm located out of state. I ran the firm through my federal criminal database and immediately recognized it as a known front organization for a violent regional crime syndicate. Suddenly, everything Darius had screamed about in the law office made terrifying sense. My father was not a brilliant criminal mastermind. He was a desperate, arrogant man who had tried to play high-stakes investment games with extremely dangerous people, and he had lost spectacularly. Darius had likely introduced my father to the syndicate, promising massive guaranteed returns on illegal cryptocurrency and shady real estate ventures. Now the investment money was entirely gone, vanished into the digital ether. The church was secretly and completely insolvent. The massive multi-million-dollar commercial mortgage on the shiny megachurch auditorium was currently 3 full months in arrears. That was the real, undeniable reason my father was panicking so intensely. If he did not get a massive injection of liquid cash immediately, the commercial bank would publicly foreclose on the church building, and the federal tax authorities would start asking terrifying, unavoidable questions about the missing millions. My father desperately needed my grandfather's $150 million estate, not to build a legacy, but to silently plug the massive gaping financial hole in his fraudulent criminal empire before the cartel or the federal government came knocking on his door. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, letting the chilling, dangerous reality wash over me. I was not just dealing with greedy, toxic parents who wanted a bigger piece of the pie. I was dealing with desperate, cornered criminals who owed massive amounts of money to very violent, ruthless people. They would stop at nothing to get my signature on that asset transfer document. I reached for my coffee mug to take a sip, but before my fingers could even touch the warm ceramic, my phone emitted a sharp, piercing emergency alert tone. It was a high-priority automated text message from my primary financial institution. I quickly picked up the phone and opened my secure banking application, expecting to see a routine security notification about a suspicious login attempt. Instead, a bold, bright red banner flashed aggressively across the top of my phone screen. Access denied account, frozen pending legal review. I stared at the bright red warning text, my analytical mind racing to catch up. I quickly tried to log into my secondary checking account. Frozen. I tried to access my high-yield savings account, where I kept my emergency funds. Frozen. I checked my investment portfolios. Frozen. Every single liquid financial asset I owned, including my payroll deposits from my corporate accounting firm, had been completely and abruptly locked down. I could not transfer a single dollar. I could not even buy a cup of coffee. I sat back and immediately knew exactly how they had orchestrated this illegal maneuver. My personal financial accounts were held at the exact same regional bank branch that handled the massive multi-million-dollar operational accounts for my father's megachurch. The senior branch manager was a man named Richard, who also happened to serve as a high-ranking senior deacon at my father's church. Richard drove a brand-new imported sports car and lived in a gated community that his middle management bank salary could never possibly afford. My father had clearly leveraged his massive religious influence and the church's enormous account balances to aggressively pressure the corrupt branch manager into placing an illegal administrative freeze on my personal funds. They were trying to completely cut off my financial resources to starve me out and force me into absolute panic. They wanted me to feel entirely helpless and isolated. They expected me to call them crying frantically, begging for access to my own hard-earned money just to buy basic groceries or pay my utility bills. They genuinely thought that stripping me of my financial independence would shatter my confidence and make me immediately compliant to their demands. It was a classic abusive isolation tactic designed to break my spirit and force me to sign over the $150 million estate just to survive. But my father and his corrupt deacon had made a massive, catastrophic miscalculation. They completely forgot who they were dealing with. I audited corrupt, arrogant banking executives for a living. I knew the strict federal banking regulations and compliance laws better than I knew my own middle name. I knew exactly which federal financial statutes Richard had just blatantly violated to appease his desperate pastor. And I knew exactly how to completely destroy his entire professional banking career before lunchtime. I calmly picked up my phone, pulled up the direct office number for the corrupt branch manager, and grabbed a thick manila folder from my leather briefcase. The game was escalating rapidly, and I was perfectly ready to play. I did not bother dialing his number. A phone call would give him the psychological advantage of hanging up or hiding behind a corporate script. Instead, I grabbed my keys, slid into my car, and drove directly to the main branch of the regional bank located right in the wealthy financial district of downtown. The heavy glass doors slid open, and I walked straight past the long line of regular customers waiting for the standard tellers. I ignored the sharply dressed security guard and marched directly toward the plush carpeted executive offices in the back. Richard had his door completely open, laughing loudly on his phone while leaning back in his expensive ergonomic chair. When he saw me walking furiously toward his office, his smug, confident smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he quickly masked it with fake corporate politeness. He hastily ended his call and stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. "Maya, what an absolute surprise to see you here today," he said, extending a perfectly manicured hand that I completely ignored. I stepped into his spacious office and used my foot to firmly kick the heavy mahogany door shut behind me. The thick soundproofing immediately cut off the ambient noise of the busy bank lobby. "Have a seat, Maya." Richard continued gesturing to the uncomfortable leather guest chairs. "I assume you are here regarding the unfortunate administrative hold on your personal checking and savings accounts." I stood perfectly still, clutching my thick leather briefcase. "You know exactly why I'm here, Richard," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. "You illegally froze my personal financial assets without a single shred of legitimate legal justification." Richard sighed heavily, adopting a highly patronizing tone like a disappointed high school principal. "Now, Maya, let us be completely reasonable here. Your father, Pastor Thomas, personally contacted me this morning. He officially notified the bank that there is a highly contentious active legal dispute regarding the massive inheritance you recently acquired. As the primary manager of this branch, I have a strict fiduciary duty to protect all contested financial assets until the formal probate courts can thoroughly sort out the messy family details. We are simply acting out of an abundance of caution to protect the church and the estate." I stared at him, letting his pathetic rehearsed lie hang in the cold air. "You do not have a fiduciary duty to my father regarding my personal financial accounts," I stated clearly. "My accounts are entirely separate from the church. You do not possess a signed court order. You do not possess a legal subpoena from a sitting federal judge. You do not even have a standard police report. You froze my accounts strictly because my father asked you to, and because you are absolutely terrified of losing the massive multi-million-dollar church operating accounts that artificially inflate your quarterly branch performance metrics." Richard narrowed his eyes, losing his fake friendly demeanor. "Listen here, young lady," he sneered, dropping the polite banker act. "I have known your father for 20 years. He is a great man of profound faith. He warned me that you were acting incredibly erratically and making highly irrational financial decisions. I am well within my corporate banking rights to place a temporary security hold on any account that shows suspicious, uncharacteristic activity. You can file a formal written complaint with the corporate customer service department if you want, but it will take them at least 45 days to even review your file. Until then, your money stays exactly where it is." I did not blink. I unclasped my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick-bound dossier I had meticulously prepared. I dropped it heavily onto the center of his pristine glass desk. The loud thud made him jump slightly. "I am not a naive little girl, Richard," I said, leaning forward, resting both of my hands flat on the cold glass of his desk. "I am a licensed certified forensic accountant. I investigate complex federal financial crimes for the federal government and massive corporate conglomerates. I know the United States banking regulations better than the corporate lawyers who drafted your employment contract. Richard glanced nervously at the thick dossier. What is that? He asked, his voice losing a significant amount of its previous arrogant volume. That is your absolute professional ruin, I replied calmly. Inside that folder is a highly detailed step-by-step breakdown of exactly how you just willfully violated the Federal Electronic Fund Transfer Act. There is also a complete comprehensive analysis of the severe criminal penalties for unauthorized banking interference without a verified judicial mandate. But it gets significantly worse for you, Richard. Because you colluded directly with a third party to restrict my personal funds, you have officially crossed the line into federal conspiracy to commit financial extortion. Richard swallowed hard, a thin bead of nervous sweat suddenly appearing on his forehead. You are completely bluffing, he stammered, trying desperately to regain his footing. I have the entire legal department of this massive bank standing right behind me. You do not have anything standing behind you, Richard. I countered, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. The corporate legal department exists to protect the bank from massive federal liability, not to protect a rogue middle management branch manager who breaks federal laws to appease his local pastor. If I walk out of this office without full unrestricted access to my money, I am going to immediately electronically submit this entire comprehensive dossier directly to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the State Attorney General's office. I will personally ensure they launch a massive, deeply invasive audit of every single transaction you have ever approved in this specific branch for the last decade. I know exactly what you have been doing with the church's offshore wire transfers, Richard. I have seen the hidden digital ledgers. If the federal authorities come digging, they are not just going to fire you. They are going to permanently revoke your banking license and send you to federal prison for a very long time. Richard visibly recoiled, his face turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He looked frantically around the soundproof office as if hoping someone would magically swoop in to save him. But we were completely alone. The suffocating silence of the room pressed heavily against him. He looked down at the dossier, then back up at my completely unreadable face. He realized in that exact terrifying moment that I was not bluffing. I was a highly trained professional apex predator in his specific financial ecosystem, and I had him entirely trapped in a lethal corner. You have exactly 60 seconds to completely lift the administrative freeze on every single one of my accounts, I said, raising my left wrist to look at my watch. 59. 58. Richard panicked. His hands shook violently as he practically dove toward his computer keyboard. He slammed his fingers against the keys, frantically typing in his high-level executive override credentials. Wait, please. Just wait a second. Maya, he pleaded, his voice cracking with sheer terror. I am doing it right now. I was just following your father's aggressive instructions. He told me it was a simple internal family matter. He promised me there would be absolutely no legal consequences. I did not respond. I just kept watching the sweeping second hand on my watch. 45, 44. A series of rapid, loud clicking sounds echoed in the quiet office as Richard desperately navigated the complex banking software. Okay, it is done, he gasped, spinning his monitor around so I could clearly see the screen. Look, the administrative hold has been completely removed. Your accounts are fully active and unrestricted. I am so incredibly sorry, Maya. Please do not send that horrifying dossier to the federal regulators. I have a wife and 3 kids. I cannot afford to lose my career over this stupid mistake. I pulled my secure encrypted smartphone from my pocket and quickly opened my mobile banking application. The bright red warning banner was completely gone. My substantial account balances were fully visible and highly liquid. I did not waste a single millisecond. Standing right there in his office, maintaining constant direct eye contact with the sweating, terrified manager, I executed a massive international wire transfer. I moved every single penny of my liquid assets directly into a highly secure, completely untraceable offshore trust account located in a jurisdiction that refused to comply with United States banking subpoenas. I watched the progress bar load and complete. My balance at his bank dropped to absolute zero. Your apologies are completely meaningless to me, Richard. I said quietly, sliding the thick dossier back into my leather briefcase and snapping it shut. You chose to play a highly dangerous illegal game with my livelihood and you lost spectacularly. Tell my father that his pathetic attempts to starve me out financially are entirely useless. Tell him the forensic accountant is now fully off the leash. I turned around and walked purposefully out of the executive office, leaving Richard slumped over his desk, breathing heavily and gripping his chest in pure panic. I strode through the busy bank lobby and out the sliding glass doors, stepping back into the warm, heavy Maryland humidity. A deep, satisfying sense of profound control washed over my entire body. I had successfully neutralized my parents' first major offensive strike and secured my personal operational funds. Now it was time to systematically dismantle the rest of their fraudulent empire. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I needed to get back to my grandparents' riverside villa to continue extracting the encrypted data from Grandpa Silas' hidden hard drives. I pulled out of the bank parking lot and merged smoothly onto the busy downtown avenue. I drove for about 10 minutes, mentally calculating my next strategic legal moves against the church elders. But as I turned onto the long, winding scenic road that led toward the secluded riverside properties, my sharp, analytical eyes caught something highly disturbing in my rearview mirror. A massive, blacked-out Mercedes G-Wagon had aggressively swerved into my lane exactly 3 cars behind me. I recognized the aggressive driving style and the distinct custom matte black rims immediately. It was my brother-in-law Darius. He was tightly tailing me, keeping a steady, calculated distance, but aggressively mimicking my every single turn. My parents had failed to break me financially at the bank, so now Darius was making his desperate physical move to secure the estate documents by any means necessary. I kept my hands lightly gripped on the leather steering wheel, monitoring his vehicle through the glass. He was driving recklessly, cutting off a small sedan just to maintain his visual contact with my rear bumper. The desperate situation with his violent cartel creditors was clearly pushing him over the edge of rational behavior. He needed the physical property deeds locked inside my grandfather's heavy iron safe to use as collateral against his massive $10 million underground debt. He probably thought I was an easy, vulnerable target driving alone on a quiet, secluded road. I tapped the center console screen of my car and calmly disabled the standard GPS tracking systems, just in case my family had somehow managed to clone my phone location data. I watched the large, aggressive black SUV accelerate, closing the distance between us, as the heavy tree line thickened around the winding road. The luxury neighborhood was quickly fading behind us, replaced by dense Maryland woods and empty stretches of highway. Darius flashed his high beams aggressively, attempting to intimidate me into pulling over to the dark shoulder of the road. I did not speed up and I did not panic. Instead, I reached into the center console and placed my hand firmly over the emergency communication button I had secretly installed the previous day. Let him follow me, I thought to myself, a cold, dangerous smile forming on my lips. Let him drive right into the absolute nightmare I have carefully prepared for him at the Riverside Villa. The game was no longer just about hidden bank accounts and corporate financial fraud. It was rapidly becoming a physical confrontation, and I was more than ready to show Darius exactly why you never corner a woman who already knows all your darkest secrets. I pressed my foot smoothly against the accelerator, leading him directly into my trap. The drive back to the Riverside Villa was tense but highly calculated. I watched the aggressive black G-Wagon drop back slightly as I turned onto the private gated access road that led to my grandfather's estate. Darius was arrogant, but he was not stupid enough to attack me in broad daylight on an open road where any passing motorist could easily witness a physical altercation. He was simply confirming my physical location. He was aggressively establishing that I was completely alone in the massive isolated house. I pulled my car into the sprawling circular driveway and used the remote control to securely lock the heavy wrought iron front gates behind me. The thick metal gates slammed shut, with a heavy resounding clank echoing across the quiet property. I walked into the quiet, empty house and immediately went to work. I had absolutely no intention of being a passive victim waiting to be rescued by a corrupt local police force that my father practically owned. I spent the next several hours actively transforming the historic Riverside property into a highly monitored digital fortress. Earlier that afternoon, recognizing the escalating physical threat, I had quietly contracted a premium private security firm. I paid them a massive premium from my newly secured offshore funds to rush the installation of state-of-the-art high-definition night vision cameras. They expertly covered every single entry point, dark hallway, and blind spot in the entire residence. I synchronized the entire sophisticated network directly to my encrypted tablet, ensuring I had absolute visual dominance over my environment. Next, I walked confidently into Grandpa Silas' old mahogany-paneled study. Hidden carefully behind a heavy classic oil painting was his massive reinforced steel wall safe. This was exactly what Darius was coming for tonight. He desperately needed the original bearer bonds and the physical property deeds to use as massive leverage to temporarily appease his violent underground creditors. I quickly entered the complex numeric combination and pulled the heavy steel door open. The thick metal hinges groaned slightly. I carefully removed every single valuable document, transferring the legacy of my grandparents into a waterproof, fireproof lockbox. I carried the heavy box upstairs and permanently hid it beneath the loose floorboards in the dusty, unused guest bedroom. I left the large wall safe completely empty, except for one very specific item. I had purchased a cheap prepaid burner phone at a local gas station on my way home from the bank. I placed the small plastic phone directly in the center of the cold, empty steel shelf, turned the ringer volume to its maximum setting, and firmly locked the heavy safe door shut. By midnight, the heavy Maryland humidity had turned into a thick, rolling fog, blanketing the dark river outside my windows. The massive colonial house was completely silent. I did not go to sleep. I did not even change into my comfortable clothes. I remained fully dressed in my dark tailored slacks and a black silk blouse. I walked quietly into the second-floor library, which offered a perfect strategic vantage point over the grand sweeping foyer below. I turned off every single light in the house, plunging the massive estate into absolute pitch-black darkness. I sat down deeply into a high-backed leather wing chair, resting my tablet squarely on my lap. I poured myself a steaming cup of bitter black coffee from a thermal carafe I had brought upstairs. I sipped the dark liquid slowly, letting the sharp caffeine keep my investigative senses on extreme high alert. I did not feel any paralyzing fear. I felt a cold, hyper-focused professional clarity. I was an experienced financial investigator, setting a perfectly baited physical trap for a desperate cornered rat. The glowing screen of my tablet illuminated my face, with a pale blue light displaying 12 different high-definition camera feeds simultaneously. I watched the perimeter intently, analyzing the shadows. 1 in the morning passed without a single incident. The only movement was the heavy wind rustling through the large ancient willow trees near the water's edge. Then exactly at 2 in the morning, the perimeter motion sensors silently triggered a flashing red alert on my digital display. I leaned forward, resting my coffee mug silently on the wooden side table. On camera 4, facing the rear patio terrace, I saw 3 dark figures emerging silently from the thick, swirling river fog. They had obviously parked their vehicle far down the private access road and approached the property cautiously on foot to avoid auditory detection. The camera software automatically switched to infrared night vision, rendering the creeping intruders in stark, glowing white silhouettes against the pitch-black background. The man in the center was undeniably my brother-in-law, Darius. Even in tactical dark clothing, I could easily recognize his nervous, erratic posture and his expensive designer sneakers, which were entirely inappropriate for a covert midnight burglary. Flanking him closely were 2 heavily muscled men wearing dark ski masks and carrying heavy steel pry bars. I analyzed the visual data instantly. These were clearly not local amateur street thugs hired for a quick smash and grab. Their disciplined tactical movements and their sheer physical size indicated they were professional muscle. They were likely sent directly by the regional crime syndicate to physically ensure Darius actually delivered the multi-million-dollar assets he had desperately promised them. If Darius failed to produce the documents tonight, these men were probably instructed to eliminate him. They bypassed the heavy reinforced front doors entirely. Instead, they moved aggressively toward the glass conservatory at the back of the house, where the security vulnerabilities were much higher. I watched calmly as one of the masked thugs raised a heavy steel tool and smashed it violently against the reinforced glass pane near the brass handle. The sharp, shattering sound of breaking glass violently pierced the absolute silence of the sleeping house, echoing loudly up the grand, sweeping staircase and reverberating through the dark hallways. I did not scream, I did not flinch in my leather chair, I did not instinctively reach for my phone to dial emergency services. Calling the local corrupt police department right now would simply allow Darius to run away into the fog and later pretend he was safely asleep in his own suburban bed. I needed him fully and undeniably committed. I needed him caught completely inside the inescapable physical web of his own massive criminal conspiracy. I watched the live high-definition video feed as the three men carefully stepped through the jagged broken window and entered the dark grand foyer. Their heavy boots crunched loudly against the shattered glass scattered across the expensive imported Persian rugs. Darius pulled a small, heavy-duty tactical flashlight from his jacket pocket, sweeping the narrow, bright beam nervously across the antique furniture and the massive crystal chandelier hanging above them. His breathing was visibly rapid and shallow. He aggressively signaled for the two masked thugs to follow him directly toward the east wing of the house. He knew exactly where he was going without needing any directions. He had visited this house dozens of times for mandatory family holiday dinners, expertly playing the role of the devoted, successful son-in-law while secretly coveting the massive generational wealth surrounding him. He led the large, armed thugs straight down the long corridor and into Grandpa Silas' mahogany-paneled study. On camera 7, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the study. I watched as Darius eagerly pulled the heavy classic oil painting off the wall, tossing it carelessly onto the hardwood floor without a second thought for its historical value. The massive steel wall safe was now fully exposed in the beam of his flashlight. The two cartel thugs stood menacingly behind him, silently watching his every move with their arms crossed. Darius' hands were shaking violently as he pulled a specialized electronic cracking device from his black backpack. The device was clearly highly sophisticated and likely provided by his dangerous criminal associates. He attached the magnetic sensors directly to the digital keypad of the safe. The small machine booted up and began running through thousands of numeric combinations in absolute terrifying silence. The tension in the small room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Darius wiped thick beads of sweat from his forehead, glancing nervously back at the silent masked men who held his life in their hands. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my bitter black coffee, waiting patiently in the darkness directly above them. The digital numbers on the cracking device spun rapidly. Finally, a loud, heavy mechanical click echoed clearly through the sensitive microphone on the security camera feed. The heavy internal steel locking bolts officially retracted. Darius let out a loud, massive sigh of sheer relief, thinking his terrifying financial nightmare was finally over. He grabbed the thick metal handle and ripped the heavy door open, shining his bright flashlight eagerly into the dark metallic cavity, expecting to find his multi-million-dollar salvation. He expected to see stacks of crisp bearer bonds and thick folders of lucrative real estate deeds. Instead, the bright beam of his flashlight illuminated absolutely nothing. The massive steel shelf was completely bare. Darius froze completely. His entire body went rigidly stiff as the horrifying reality of the empty safe crashed over him. The two masked thugs stepped aggressively closer, peering over his shoulder into the empty dark space. One of the thugs aggressively grabbed Darius by the back of his jacket, yanking him roughly backward. Darius started stammering frantically, raising his hands in a desperate, pleading gesture, trying to explain the impossible disappearance of the funds. Before his panicked, terrified brain could even process the shocking reality of his imminent demise, I picked up my personal smartphone from the wooden side table and calmly dialed the prepaid number. Downstairs inside the dark, empty steel safe, the cheap burner phone instantly began to ring with a loud, piercing, relentless electronic tone, completely shattering the silence of the room. Darius stared at the ringing phone in pure, unadulterated horror. The sharp electronic tone echoed off the mahogany panels of the study, wrapping around him like a physical chain. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the cheap plastic device. He pressed the green answer button and slowly brought the speaker to his ear. I watched him on the high-definition camera, feed my finger hovering directly over the master lighting control on my encrypted tablet. "Hello, Darius," I said, my voice dropping into the cold, empty metal safe and transmitting directly into his ear. "You seem to have misplaced something you were looking for." Darius let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp and dropped the phone as if it had physically burned him. The small device clattered against the steel floor of the safe, echoing loudly in the quiet room. In that exact second, I firmly pressed the master switch on my digital tablet. The heavy darkness of the grand estate shattered instantly. Thousands of watts of high-intensity LED security floodlights ignited simultaneously, both inside the study and completely surrounding the exterior perimeter of the house. The blinding white light completely washed out their night vision. Darius shrieked, raising his arms to shield his eyes. The two heavily muscled masked thugs immediately dropped their heavy steel pry bars, cursing loudly, and reaching into their tactical jackets for their concealed weapons. But they were completely out of time and out of their depth. Before their hands could even grasp the grips of their firearms, the heavy mahogany double doors of the study swung violently open. Four massive private security contractors dressed in full black tactical gear and carrying suppressed automatic rifles stepped smoothly into the room. They moved with terrifying, coordinated military precision, fanning out to instantly dominate the tight space and eliminate any crossfire angles. "Drop your weapons right now, or you will not leave this room alive," the lead contractor barked, his red laser sight resting squarely on the center mass of the larger thug. The two masked men froze completely. They were professional criminals who understood basic survival mathematics perfectly. They were standing in a brilliantly lit room, completely outgunned by highly trained military veterans who already had their weapons drawn and sighted. The thugs slowly and carefully raised their empty hands, stepping entirely away from their concealed holsters. They looked down at Darius, who was currently cowering on the floor next to the empty wall safe, whimpering softly. They made a rapid, silent, mutual decision. Darius was officially dead weight, and fighting for him was not in their contract. The larger thug kicked Darius roughly in the ribs, stepping over him to face the tactical security team. "We are standing down," the thug growled, keeping his hands high in the air. "This is not our fight." "Smart decision," I called out, projecting my voice clearly down from the second-floor interior balcony that overlooked the grand foyer just outside the study. I walked slowly out of the shadows and leaned forward, resting my hands on the smooth, polished oak banister. I looked down at the pathetic, miserable scene playing out in my grandfather's sacred workspace. "Let the two professionals walk out the front door," I instructed my security team. They were just hired muscle following a paycheck. "Do not engage them unless they draw. But keep the guy on the floor exactly where he is." The security contractors expertly disarmed the two masked men, confiscating their heavy firearms and tossing them onto the expensive Persian rug. They forcefully escorted the two thugs out the broken conservatory doors, watching them disappear quickly into the thick, rolling river fog. Darius was left entirely alone, kneeling on the floor, surrounded by three highly armed security professionals whose rifles were now pointed directly at his head. He looked up at me, standing calmly on the high balcony, and his entire arrogant fake Wall Street persona completely evaporated into the cold night air. "Maya, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate sob. He scrambled forward on his knees, his expensive designer sneakers sliding against the polished hardwood floor, leaving dark scuff marks. "You have to help me. You have to give me those property deeds right now. You do not understand the terrifying, ruthless people I am dealing with. They are going to absolutely destroy everything." "I understand perfectly, Darius," I replied, my voice echoing coldly through the massive open space, entirely devoid of any sympathy. "You ran a highly fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme to fund your pathetic luxury lifestyle, and when the legitimate money ran out, you decided to borrow heavily from a violent regional crime syndicate. And now they want their massive return on investment." Darius began weeping openly, heavy tears streaming down his face and soaking into the thick collar of his dark tactical jacket. "It is $10 million, Maya," he screamed, his voice echoing with sheer unadulterated terror. "I owe them $10 million in untraceable cash by this Friday night. If I do not physically hand over the collateral, they promise they are going to execute me. And they are not going to stop with me, Maya. They know exactly where Chloe sleeps. They know her daily schedule down to the minute. They said they would kidnap my wife and skin her alive to make a terrifying example out of my massive failure. You have to protect your younger sister, Maya. You have to show some basic family loyalty. We are blood." I stared down at him, gripping the smooth oak banister tightly. Family loyalty. I repeated the words, tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. "You dare stand in the exact house of the grandfather you eagerly waited to die and invoke the sacred concept of family loyalty. You literally broke into my home in the middle of the night with armed men intending to steal my legal inheritance, and now you expect me to happily liquidate my grandparents' lifelong legacy to pay off your dirty criminal gambling debts?" Darius slammed his forehead against the hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably like a broken child. "I was desperate, Maya," he wailed, beating his fists against the wood. "Your father told me the safe would be absolutely packed with bearer bonds. He said it would completely solve all of our massive financial problems in one single night. Pastor Thomas swore to me you would be completely terrified and submissive. He said you were just a weak little accountant who would just easily roll over and cry if we applied a tiny bit of physical pressure. He told me to just take the heavy documents, and he would personally handle all the complicated legal fallout using his corrupt church lawyers." My analytical mind captured every single word he was saying, perfectly filing it away into my mental ledger. My father, the holy righteous megachurch pastor, had actively conspired to orchestrate a violent armed home invasion against his own daughter to cover up his massive money laundering operation. He had intentionally weaponized his desperate son-in-law, treating Darius like a disposable pawn in a highly dangerous chess match. This was no longer just about financial fraud. It was a coordinated criminal conspiracy to commit armed robbery and extortion. "Please, Maya," Darius begged again, raising his tear-stained face to look up at me. "Just give me one of the smaller commercial warehouses. Just a single piece of property I can quickly sign over to them. I will slowly pay you back every single penny, I swear on my life. Chloe is your own flesh and blood, Maya. You cannot just let these violent cartel monsters murder your own baby sister. You have the money. You can completely save us right now. You can fix everything." I looked at his desperate, pathetic face. I thought about Chloe, my beautiful golden sister who had spent her entire privileged life mocking my clothes, taking aggressive credit for my academic achievements, and happily spending the very same stolen church money that had eventually bought that fake shiny G-Wagon currently parked in my driveway. I thought about how she had eagerly sat in Evelyn's law office yesterday, screaming that I was a selfish thief for not immediately handing over my entire inheritance to fund her fake wealthy lifestyle. Chloe and Darius had built their entire hollow marriage on a massive foundation of toxic lies and fraudulent financial vanity. Now the incredibly heavy bill had finally come due. I stood up straight, adjusting the collar of my black silk blouse. I stared down at the man who had just brought armed thugs into my sanctuary. I did not feel a single drop of pity or familial obligation. I only felt a cold, calculating resolve to finish exactly what my grandparents had trusted me to do. "Your massive $10 million debt is your own personal funeral, Darius," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying absolute zero. "I am not a bank. I am not a charity. And I am definitely not your savior. You and Chloe built this incredibly dangerous criminal house of cards, and now you get to sit inside it while it burns completely to the ground." Darius screamed in pure horrified panic, lunging toward the sweeping staircase, as if he intended to climb up and physically attack me. The security contractors reacted instantly. The lead guard stepped forward aggressively, grabbing Darius by the back of his tactical jacket and slamming him forcefully back onto the hardwood floor. Darius thrashed and kicked, screaming my name and cursing my soul. "Get him out of my house," I ordered, turning my back on the pathetic scene below. "Throw him completely off the private property. If he sets a single foot back on this estate, you have my full authorization to use lethal force. The massive guards hauled the screaming, thrashing man up off the floor, dragging him roughly toward the shattered glass of the conservatory doors. Darius' frantic screams echoed into the thick rolling river fog, fading slowly, as they forcefully ejected him into the cold, dark night. I stood alone on the interior balcony, the brilliant security lights casting long, sharp shadows across the grand foyer. The house was finally quiet again. I calmly picked up my digital tablet from the side table. The red recording light was still flashing brightly, indicating that every single high-definition camera had perfectly captured the entire desperate confrontation. I tapped the screen and securely saved the crystal-clear audio file of Darius fully confessing to his massive cartel debt and explicitly confirming my father's direct criminal involvement in organizing the armed home invasion. I uploaded the heavy encrypted video files directly to my offshore cloud servers, creating a permanent, undeniable digital record of their absolute desperation. The physical threat had been successfully neutralized, but the deeper investigation was just beginning. I walked back toward the dark study to continue auditing my grandfather's hidden hard drives. I needed to find the ultimate missing link that would finally bury my father permanently. The confrontation with Darius had completely shifted my perspective on the entire situation. My parents were not just acting out of standard corporate greed or desperate social climbing. You do not send armed cartel thugs to terrorize your own daughter in the middle of the night just to maintain a country club membership or a leased luxury vehicle. There was a massive ticking clock hanging over my father's head, and the explosive consequences of his failure were clearly fatal. I locked the heavy mahogany doors of the study from the inside and turned on a single low-wattage desk lamp. I pulled back the expensive Persian rug that Darius and his hired muscle had trampled over earlier. My grandfather Silas had been a man who trusted physical architecture far more than digital clouds. He had secretly instructed me years ago about a specific hollow cavity beneath the original oak floorboards, right beneath his heavy vintage safe. I used a flathead screwdriver to carefully pry up the designated wooden plank. Hidden inside the dark, dusty recess was a heavy black waterproof pelican case. I pulled it out and set it squarely on the massive wooden desk. Inside, the protective foam rested two solid state-encrypted hard drives and a physical hardware key. This was the true legacy of Silas. He knew his son was a deeply corrupt and highly dangerous man. Grandpa Silas had spent the last 5 years of his life silently compiling a massive airtight digital dossier against his own child. He had deliberately left it for me because he knew I was the only person in the entire family with the forensic accounting skills necessary to decode it and the emotional detachment required to actually use it. I connected the primary drive to my encrypted workstation and inserted the physical hardware key. A command prompt flashed on my high-resolution screen, demanding a complex alphanumeric passphrase. I typed in the sequence Silas had whispered to me during his final days in the hospital. Access granted. The sheer volume of raw financial data that flooded my screen was absolutely staggering. There were thousands of nested folders containing decades of complex corporate tax returns, highly confidential bank statements, wire transfer logs, and encrypted email archives. I immediately initiated a specialized forensic sorting algorithm designed to flag massive irregular offshore transactions and known high-risk banking jurisdictions. While the powerful software crunched the massive datasets, I stared out the shattered conservatory window into the thick rolling river fog. My father, Pastor Thomas, had spent his entire adult life preaching aggressively about the devastating consequences of moral corruption. He stood on a brightly lit acrylic stage every single Sunday, demanding a strict 10% tithe from hard-working, honest people, claiming God would miraculously multiply their financial blessings. In reality, he was systematically draining their modest retirement accounts to fund an incredibly reckless criminal enterprise. My computer chimed sharply, signaling that the complex forensic algorithm had successfully completed its primary sort. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitors and began to expertly follow the digital money trail. The initial layers were exactly what I had discovered earlier in the day. There were dozens of fake shell companies registered under my mother's name, designed specifically to siphon off the legitimate church building fund. But as I dug deeper into the highly encrypted secondary folders, the financial landscape shifted from standard corporate embezzlement to something far more sinister and highly organized. I found a massive hidden subledger that was completely detached from the legitimate church operating accounts. This specific ledger was aggressively tracking weekly incoming cash deposits that far exceeded the standard Sunday offering collections. We were talking about millions of dollars in untraceable physical cash flowing rapidly through the church's massive administrative banking infrastructure every single month. I leaned closer to the screen, my trained eyes rapidly scanning the complex numerical columns. The cash was being intentionally deposited in structured increments carefully kept just under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold to avoid triggering automatic suspicious activity reports at the regional bank. This was a classic sophisticated method known as smurfing. Once the dirty cash was successfully integrated into the legitimate megachurch banking system, my father would immediately wire the massive funds to the out-of-state commercial real estate development firm I had identified earlier. He was using the sacred tax-exempt status of his massive religious organization as a completely invisible, impenetrable shield to wash dirty street money. I cross-referenced the outgoing wire transfer dates with the internal communication logs stored on the drive. My father had been holding secret weekly meetings with the very same violent regional crime syndicate that Darius had just desperately screamed about. Pastor Thomas was not just a victim of a bad investment scheme. He was their primary regional money launderer. He was washing their highly illegal drug and extortion profits through the massive church infrastructure and taking a substantial percentage right off the top for his own personal use. That was exactly how he afforded the custom Italian suits, the extravagant luxury vacations to Dubai, and the massive sprawling suburban mansion. But the digital ledger revealed a massive catastrophic disruption that occurred exactly 6 months ago. According to the meticulous records, Grandpa Silas had secretly compiled, a massive federal audit of a connected shell company had completely frozen a substantial portion of the syndicate's laundered funds. $40 million to be exact. The money was entirely trapped in an offshore banking purgatory, indefinitely inaccessible to both my father and the violent criminals who actually owned it. The crime syndicate did not care about federal banking regulations or frozen offshore accounts. They only cared that Pastor Thomas had suddenly lost $40 million of their highly illegal capital. They had undoubtedly given him a strict non-negotiable deadline to replace the massive missing funds or face severe lethal consequences. The entire terrifying puzzle suddenly snapped perfectly into place. My father's sudden aggressive desperation, his extreme panic over the reading of the will, his illegal freezing of my personal bank accounts, and his direct coordination of an armed midnight home invasion with his terrified son-in-law. He did not want the $150 million estate to simply maintain his lavish prosperity gospel lifestyle. He needed the massive liquid assets immediately because the ruthless crime syndicate was actively threatening to execute him and our entire family if he did not promptly deliver their $40 million. He was perfectly willing to completely sacrifice my life, my safety, and my grandfather's entire historical legacy just to save his own miserable skin from the violent criminals he had eagerly crawled into bed with. I sat back in the heavy leather chair feeling a profound, chilling disgust wash over my entire body. I had always known my parents were deeply flawed, narcissistic, and highly manipulative individuals. I knew they were greedy and shallow. But I had never fully comprehended the sheer terrifying magnitude of their active criminal depravity. My father was a high-level federal criminal masquerading as a righteous holy man. He was actively destroying the lives of 10,000 faithful congregants and directly funding a violent criminal organization that poisoned the very community he pretended to spiritually lead. The forensic evidence I had just successfully compiled was entirely enough to send him to a maximum security federal penitentiary for the absolute rest of his natural life. I had the smoking gun firmly in my hands. But Grandpa Silas was an incredibly thorough man. He never left a job completely unfinished. I noticed that the primary forensic sorting algorithm had completely ignored one specific heavily encrypted folder located at the very bottom of the massive digital directory. The folder was simply labeled insurance. It was protected by an entirely different secondary encryption protocol, requiring a completely separate authentication key. I quickly pulled the heavy black Pelican case back across the desk and inspected the dense protective foam. Hidden completely underneath the bottom layer was a small digital storage drive resembling a standard flash drive. I plugged it directly into an open port on my workstation. The heavy encryption on the insurance folder instantly dissolved, granting me full, unrestricted access to its hidden contents. I anticipated finding more complex banking ledgers, or perhaps highly incriminating audio recordings of my father directly discussing his illegal money laundering operations with the syndicate bosses. Instead, the folder contained a very small collection of high-definition video files. The files were automatically time-stamped with a date that made my heart completely stop beating in my chest. It was the exact date my grandparents had supposedly died in a tragic, unavoidable multi-vehicle car accident on the rainy interstate highway. My hands actually trembled slightly as I reached out and double-clicked the very first video file in the sequence. A high-definition media player instantly launched on my screen. The video perspective was clearly from a sophisticated aftermarket dashboard camera, stealthily installed inside my grandfather's heavy luxury sedan. The digital timestamp in the lower right corner ticked forward, displaying the exact hour and minute leading up to their violent deaths. I watched the familiar local scenery roll past the windshield as Grandpa Silas drove steadily through the heavy pouring rain. But it was the crystal-clear interior audio recording that made the blood freeze entirely solid in my veins. This was not just a compilation of complex financial crimes anymore. This was something infinitely darker and far more terrifying than stolen money. The heavy oak desk felt like the only solid thing left in the entire world as the horrifying, undeniable truth of their final moments began to play out right in front of my eyes. The high-definition camera mounted behind the rearview mirror perfectly captured the interior cabin of the luxury sedan. I could hear the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers aggressively pushing away the relentless Maryland rain. Grandpa Silas was holding the steering wheel with both hands, his posture rigid and highly focused. Grandma Ruby sat in the passenger seat calmly reading a hardcover book illuminated by the dim overhead reading light. They looked so peaceful, so entirely unaware of the absolute evil that was rapidly accelerating toward them. The audio feed was incredibly sharp, picking up the ambient sounds of the luxury interior and their quiet, casual conversation. "Silas," my grandmother said, her voice warm and deeply familiar. "Thomas called again this morning while you were meeting with Evelyn at the law office. He sounded incredibly frantic. He was demanding to know if the trust paperwork had been finalized yet." I watched Grandpa Silas shake his head, his jaw tightening visibly on the screen. "Let him panic," Silas replied, his deep voice laced with profound disappointment. "I gave that boy every single opportunity to build a righteous, honest life. I built an entire commercial empire from the ground up so he would never have to struggle. And instead he chose to play dangerous games with the absolute worst kind of street criminals. He is drowning, Ruby, and he expects us to hand over our entire life work so he can buy himself a few more months of fake holy prestige. I will not let him drag this family name through the mud to save his own miserable skin. The inheritance goes to Maya. She is the only one who actually understands the true value of hard work." I felt a sharp lump form in my throat, but I forced myself to keep watching. The luxury sedan began to descend a long, steep grade on the slick interstate highway. The heavy rain reduced visibility, making the upcoming sharp curve highly dangerous. I watched Grandpa Silas gently press his foot against the brake pedal to reduce their downhill speed. The audio feed picked up a strange, unnatural grinding sound, followed immediately by a loud, sharp snap, echoing from beneath the heavy floorboards. Silas suddenly sat up completely straight, violently pumping his right foot against the floorboard. The heavy car did not slow down. In fact, it was rapidly accelerating down the steep, slick incline, completely, entirely out of control. "What is wrong?" Ruby asked, her voice suddenly spiking with genuine alarm. Silas pumped the brakes again, frantically gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. "The brakes are completely gone!" he shouted, his voice tight with rising panic. "There is absolutely no pressure. Hold on, Ruby. Hold on tight." The next 40 seconds of the video were an absolute agonizing nightmare. I watched helplessly as my grandfather desperately tried to downshift the automatic transmission, throwing the heavy luxury car into a lower gear, but the steep momentum was simply too massive. The sharp, treacherous curve of the interstate rushed toward them at a terrifying, impossible speed. In those final chaotic moments, Grandpa Silas did not scream in blind terror. Instead, he shouted something that completely solidified the chilling reality of this premeditated assassination. The maintenance logs he yelled over the roaring engine noise. Thomas canceled the dealership service appointment yesterday. He had his own mechanic take the car. That treacherous coward cut the brake lines. Ruby, I am so sorry. The loud, deafening crunch of crushing metal and shattering glass violently assaulted the computer speakers. The heavy luxury sedan slammed aggressively into the concrete median, flipping violently over the steep embankment and plunging into the dark forested ravine below. The camera violently shook the interior cabin, spinning in a chaotic blur of deploying airbags and flying debris. Then the video feed abruptly cut to static, leaving only the horrifying hissing sound of a ruptured radiator and the heavy, relentless pouring rain. I sat completely frozen in the heavy leather chair. The silence in the mahogany study was absolutely deafening. My blood ran completely cold, turning to pure ice in my veins, but my hands resting firmly on the edge of the desk did not shake even a fraction of a millimeter. Any lingering shred of familial obligation, any tiny microscopic fragment of a daughter's natural love for her father was instantly and permanently incinerated. Pastor Thomas was not just a greedy, manipulative narcissist. He was not just a sophisticated corporate money launderer or a desperate cornered fraud. He was a cold-blooded, calculating double murderer. He had intentionally, deliberately sabotaged his own elderly parents' vehicle. Knowing perfectly well they were driving down a steep, slick mountain pass in a heavy rainstorm. He had executed them without a single ounce of hesitation, simply because he needed their money to cover his massive criminal debts and save his own pathetic artificial reputation. I closed the media player and opened the remaining files inside the highly encrypted insurance folder. Grandpa Silas had been incredibly thorough, even in his final days. He had apparently suspected that Thomas might resort to extreme physical violence. Included in the hidden folder was a scanned copy of the official luxury dealership maintenance schedule, clearly showing a canceled brake service appointment exactly 1 day before the fatal crash. The cancellation was officially authorized by Pastor Thomas. Right next to that document was a digital wire transfer receipt. My father had electronically sent $25,000 to a local shady auto repair shop owned by a man with extensive known ties to the regional crime syndicate. The puzzle was complete. It was an airtight, undeniable, completely undeniable chain of premeditated capital murder. My breathing slowed down, becoming highly rhythmic and completely controlled. The emotional shockwave had successfully passed through my system, leaving behind nothing but a lethal, cold-blooded forensic clarity. I was no longer the estranged daughter desperately trying to survive a toxic family dynamic. I was the absolute ruthless executioner of justice. I systematically copied every single encrypted file, every banking ledger, every audio confession from Darius and the horrifying dashboard camera footage onto 3 separate highly secure external drives. I uploaded the entire massive data package to a redundant offshore cloud server protected by military-grade encryption protocols. If anything happened to me, the devastating evidence would automatically trigger and send directly to the highest levels of federal law enforcement and national media outlets. My father had successfully played God from his expensive acrylic pulpit for 3 decades. Now it was my turn to bring down the absolute terrifying wrath of the heavens directly onto his head. I checked the large grandfather clock standing in the corner of the dark study. It was just past 6 in the morning. The heavy rolling fog outside the shattered conservatory window was slowly beginning to lift, revealing the pale gray light of the early dawn. I had been sitting at the computer for hours, meticulously dismantling my father's entire fraudulent existence. The armed home invasion orchestrated by Darius felt like it happened an entire lifetime ago. My family was going to wake up this morning thinking they had successfully intimidated me. They genuinely believed their midnight raid had weakened my resolve. They had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding the loaded smoking gun that would end their freedom forever. I stood up from the heavy oak desk and systematically shut down the encrypted workstation. I placed the original solid-state drive safely back inside the waterproof Pelican case and locked it securely inside a hidden floor safe located in the adjacent hallway. I needed to carefully prepare my next physical moves. I needed to officially contact my federal connections to arrange a highly coordinated tactical strike. I walked out of the study and headed toward the massive sweeping staircase, intending to take a quick hot shower and change into a fresh tailored suit. I needed to look absolutely professional and entirely untouchable for the war that was about to begin. But before my foot could even touch the very first polished wooden step, a series of loud, aggressive, booming knocks echoed violently through the quiet grand foyer. The heavy, repetitive pounding against the thick wrought iron front doors was incredibly aggressive, shaking the expensive stained glass panels. I immediately pulled up the exterior security camera feed on my encrypted tablet. Standing aggressively on my front porch, illuminated by the early morning light, was a large, muscular man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit. He was not a delivery driver, and he was certainly not a neighbor coming to check on the shattered glass in the back. He held a thick stack of manila legal folders clamped tightly under his left arm. He raised his heavy fist and violently pounded on the custom iron door again, demanding immediate entry. I walked calmly across the sweeping foyer, my high heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I did not unlock the deadbolt. Instead, I pressed the interior intercom button located right next to the massive entryway. "State your business," I demanded, my voice echoing clearly through the exterior heavy-duty speakers. The large man stepped back slightly, looking up at the high-definition security camera mounted above the porch. "Maya Vance," he barked in a gruff, authoritative voice. "I am an official county process server. I have an urgent legally binding court order requiring your immediate personal signature. Open the door right now, or I will immediately contact the local sheriff's department to enforce this mandatory judicial summons." I knew exactly what this was. My father had failed to break me financially at the bank, and his desperate armed midnight robbery had failed completely. So he was immediately pivoting to his third and most corrupt strategic offensive. He was aggressively leveraging his deep political connections within the local municipal government. I reached forward and slowly unlatched the heavy deadbolt, pulling the massive iron door open just a few inches. The aggressive process server immediately shoved a thick manila envelope through the narrow gap directly into my hands. "You are officially served," he sneered, stepping back off the porch. I closed the heavy door, locked it securely, and looked down at the thick legal document. The front page was boldly stamped with the official seal of the local county court. It was a mandatory emergency eviction notice. The document falsely and maliciously claimed that I was actively engaging in severe elder fraud and that I posed a massive immediate physical threat to the structural integrity of the historic estate. But what truly made my blood boil was the incredibly prominent signature resting at the very bottom of the page. It was signed by Judge Harold Montgomery, a notoriously corrupt local magistrate who just happened to sit on the highly exclusive executive board of my father's massive megachurch. The document demanded that I completely vacate the Riverside property within 24 hours, or face immediate forceful extraction by armed local police. My father was using a completely corrupt legal system to physically throw me out onto the street. He was officially bringing the war directly to my front porch, and he was bringing the corrupt local law enforcement with him. I walked back into the grand foyer and laid the thick manila envelope onto the polished mahogany entrance table. The heavy paper felt toxic under my fingertips. I carefully extracted the legal documents, spreading them out under the warm glow of the antique chandelier. The primary document was a 24-hour emergency eviction order. It was a highly unusual, completely expedited legal maneuver that typically required overwhelming, undeniable physical evidence of an immediate threat. But there was absolutely no evidence attached. Instead, the document was entirely filled with malicious, fabricated affidavits. My father, Pastor Thomas, had actually convinced 3 senior church elders to officially swear under penalty of perjury that they had personally witnessed me physically and emotionally abusing my grandparents during their final months. They claimed I had systematically isolated Silas and Ruby, aggressively denying them access to their own bank accounts and forcefully coercing them into signing the amended will. It was a masterful stroke of pure sociopathic projection. My father was legally accusing me of the exact financial and physical crimes he had actually committed. I traced my finger down to the bottom of the final page, stopping at the bold black signature of Judge Harold Montgomery. I knew exactly who Harold was. He was not just a local municipal magistrate. He was a founding member of my father's massive megachurch, and he currently sat on the highly exclusive Executive Financial Board. Harold drove a luxury imported sedan and lived in an exclusive gated community heavily subsidized by the church's charitable housing fund. My father had effectively weaponized the local municipal court system, utilizing a corrupt judge whose lavish lifestyle completely depended on the massive illegal money laundering operation I had just uncovered. They genuinely believed that slapping a shiny official court seal on a stack of aggressive lies would instantly terrify me into absolute submission. They expected me to panic pack a small suitcase and run away into the early morning fog, leaving the $150 million estate completely unguarded. My secure smartphone vibrated sharply against the hard surface of the mahogany table, breaking the heavy silence of the grand foyer. The caller identification screen flashed brightly, displaying my father's private cell phone number. I did not answer it immediately. I let it vibrate 3 distinct times, taking a deep, controlled breath to completely center my emotions. I tapped the screen to answer the call and immediately pressed the digital recording icon, ensuring every single syllable he was about to utter would be permanently captured and secured on my encrypted offshore servers. I lifted the phone to my ear, but I did not say a single word. I simply waited for him to fill the empty digital space. "Well, Maya," my father's deep, booming baritone voice echoed aggressively through the tiny phone speaker. "I assume you have just received my official morning delivery." The county process server explicitly confirmed he handed the legal documents directly to you. I remained completely silent, standing perfectly still in the quiet house. I could hear the faint, rhythmic clicking of a turn signal in the background, indicating my father was currently driving his heavy luxury Rolls-Royce, probably heading toward his lavish church office to prepare his Sunday sermon. "You really thought you could outsmart me?" he continued, his voice dripping with intense, arrogant condescension. "You genuinely thought that just because you have a fancy corporate accounting degree and a sharp tongue, you could simply waltz in here and steal my entire generational legacy? You are nothing but an arrogant, naive little girl playing an incredibly dangerous man's game. I built this entire town, Maya. I built the massive congregation. I built the incredible political connections. I feed the local politicians. I fund the municipal re-election campaigns. And I personally counsel the absolute highest-ranking law enforcement officers in this entire county. You do not have a single friend left in this city. You do not have a single ally who will stand up against my massive public influence." I walked slowly back into the dark study, carrying the phone in my left hand. I sat down at the heavy oak desk and picked up a high-quality fountain pen. I pulled a clean legal pad toward me and began to meticulously transcribe his exact phrasing. His massive, uncontrollable, narcissistic ego was heavily bleeding into his aggressive monologue, providing me with unprecedented direct verbal confirmation of his sweeping political corruption. "Judge Montgomery is a highly reasonable man," my father gloated, the malicious smirk practically audible through the cellular connection. "He immediately recognized the severe, incredible danger you pose to the historic estate. By exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, the local sheriff's department will arrive at the Riverside Villa. They will not be polite, Maya. They will not ask you to leave nicely. They are fully authorized to physically breach the heavy front doors, aggressively secure the entire perimeter, and forcefully remove you from the premises in handcuffs if you offer even a single fraction of an ounce of resistance. You will be formally booked into the county jail on severe felony charges of elder abuse and massive financial fraud. The local media will absolutely crucify you. Your prestigious corporate accounting firm will immediately terminate your employment contract to avoid the massive public relations nightmare. You will lose absolutely everything. He paused, taking a deep, dramatic breath, savoring his perceived ultimate victory. But because I am a deeply righteous man of God, he whispered, his tone shifting into a fake, sickeningly sweet register. I am willing to offer you one final act of pure grace. If you voluntarily walk out of that house right now, leaving the original property deeds and the bearer bonds completely intact on the kitchen counter, I will personally call the sheriff and cancel the arrest warrant. I will let you quietly disappear back to your sad, lonely corporate life. You have exactly 24 hours to make the smartest decision of your entire pathetic existence. I finished writing my meticulous forensic notes on the yellow legal pad. I carefully placed the expensive fountain pen down onto the smooth wooden desk. My father had laid all his corrupt cards completely face up on the table. He was incredibly confident because he completely controlled the tiny local municipal fishbowl. He had absolutely no idea that I was about to drop a massive federal anvil directly onto his glass castle. Are you quite finished, Thomas? I asked, my voice incredibly calm, steady, and entirely devoid of any fear or intimidation. My father hesitated, clearly taken aback by my complete lack of emotional panic. He had fully expected me to be sobbing uncontrollably or aggressively screaming desperate threats. My absolute icy detachment deeply unsettled him. You have 24 hours, Maya, he growled, his voice losing a significant amount of its previous arrogant theatrical flair. Do not be completely stupid, B. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, looking at the hidden floor safe where the horrifying murder evidence was currently secured. You have spent your entire life strictly relying on cheap theatrical intimidation to aggressively bully incredibly weak people, I stated flatly. You genuinely believe that buying a few corrupt local deputies and bribing a miserable municipal judge makes you an untouchable king. But you are not a king, Thomas. You are just a desperate, pathetic, cornered criminal who leaves an incredibly sloppy digital money trail everywhere you go. You listen to me, you insolent little, he started to shout, losing his temper completely. Make sure you wear your absolute best tailored suit tomorrow morning. Dad, I interrupted, cutting his aggressive screaming off with a cold, razor-sharp precision. Because when the authorities arrive at this estate tomorrow, you are going to want to look perfectly presentable for the high-definition news cameras. I lowered the phone and firmly pressed the red disconnect button, completely terminating the secure connection. I placed the phone down on the desk and let out a long, slow, controlled breath. The ultimate battlefield was officially set. My father was bringing his corrupt local sheriff deputies tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock to aggressively force me out of the villa and illegally seize the $150 million estate to pay off his massive lethal cartel debts. If I relied on the local municipal police department, I would be immediately arrested, silenced, and completely destroyed. I needed a massive, overwhelming tactical force that operated entirely outside my father's incredibly toxic sphere of regional political influence. I needed the federal government. I picked up my secure smartphone and opened my highly encrypted contacts application. I scrolled past the regular corporate clients and the standard legal associates until I found a very specific, highly sensitive name. Special Agent Sterling. He was a senior tactical investigator for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, the IRS-CI. Most average citizens only feared the FBI or the DEA. But as a seasoned forensic accountant, I knew the absolute terrifying truth. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division possessed a nearly perfect conviction rate. They were the absolute most ruthless, heavily armed, and legally aggressive federal agents in the entire United States government. They did not care about local church politics, they did not care about corrupt municipal judges, and they absolutely did not care about Pastor Thomas and his massive fake religious reputation. They only cared about massive federal tax evasion, severe wire fraud, and sophisticated international money laundering networks. Agent Sterling and I had crossed paths 3 years ago during a massive corporate auditing investigation involving a highly corrupt logistics conglomerate. I had provided his federal team with the exact undeniable forensic financial evidence they desperately needed to successfully dismantle the entire criminal organization. Sterling had specifically told me to call him directly if I ever stumbled across another massive, sophisticated financial crime syndicate. My father's $40 million money laundering operation and his desperate lethal ties to the violent regional cartel perfectly fit the exact federal criteria. I glanced at the grandfather clock. It was nearly 7 in the morning. Federal agents worked extremely early hours, especially when actively building massive RICO cases against violent criminal syndicates. I tapped the green call button and lifted the secure phone to my ear, listening to the crisp, digital ringing tone. The line clicked open after only 2 rings. Sterling, speaking a sharp professional voice, answered immediately. "Agent Sterling, this is Maya Vance," I said, my tone slipping effortlessly into a highly professional, entirely clinical cadence. "I am calling to officially cash in that massive favor you owe me. I have an incredibly urgent, highly sensitive situation involving a $40 million international money laundering operation, a violent regional extortion syndicate, and undeniable video evidence of a double capital homicide. The primary target is Pastor Thomas of the Maryland megachurch. He is planning a coordinated armed assault on my physical location tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, utilizing heavily corrupted local law enforcement officers. I need massive immediate federal intervention, and I have the absolute complete digital ledger to permanently secure your entire career." There was a brief, heavy silence on the federal line as Special Agent Sterling rapidly processed the massive tactical weight of my incredible statement. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely stripped of any casual pleasantries. "Where exactly are you, Maya?" he asked, his tone indicating he was already standing up and grabbing his federal tactical gear. I gave him the exact private address of the Riverside Villa. The board was perfectly set. The local municipal corruption was about to violently collide with the absolute crushing weight of the United States federal government, and I was going to be standing right in the center of the massive explosion, watching my father's entire fraudulent empire burn completely to the ground. I did not wait for the sun to fully rise. I grabbed the heavy waterproof Pelican case containing my grandfather's encrypted hard drives and slipped quietly out the back door of the Riverside Villa. I drove my personal vehicle through the lifting morning fog, taking a highly circuitous route to ensure absolutely no one was following me. I headed straight toward a nondescript industrial business park on the outskirts of Baltimore. This was not a public-facing federal building with giant official seals and marble columns. It was a covert operational field office utilized specifically by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division for highly sensitive active operations. I pulled into the empty parking lot and walked toward an unmarked steel door at the back of the facility. Special Agent Sterling was already waiting for me inside the sterile, brightly lit briefing room. He was a tall, imposing man with sharp, calculating eyes and a completely no-nonsense demeanor. He wore a dark tactical polo shirt and had his federal badge visibly clipped to his belt, right next to his standard-issue sidearm. We skipped the standard pleasantries completely. I placed the heavy black Pelican case directly onto the center of the metal briefing table and popped the sturdy latches open. "You said you had the inside ledger?" Maya Sterling said, leaning forward and resting his hands on the cold metal table. "Tell me you actually brought the smoking gun, because we have been trying to physically nail Pastor Thomas to the wall for the past 4 years. "I brought you the entire execution squad," I replied calmly, sliding the primary solid-state drive across the table toward him. I opened my encrypted laptop and securely connected the drive, bringing up the massive organized file directories I had compiled overnight. My father is not just skimming cash from the weekly offering plates, Sterling. He is the primary regional money launderer for the Eastern Seaboard Syndicate. I have the exact routing numbers, the hidden offshore shell companies, and the complete daily transaction logs. He has been systematically washing millions of dollars in highly illegal street cash through his tax-exempt megachurch infrastructure for nearly a decade. Sterling stared at the high-resolution screen, his sharp eyes rapidly tracking the complex financial flowcharts I had generated. He let out a low, sharp whistle. "We knew the local syndicate was aggressively moving massive amounts of cash through this specific county," he murmured, typing a few rapid commands into his own secure federal terminal. But we could never physically bridge the gap between the violent street-level enforcers and the sophisticated corporate banking sector. Thomas used the religious exemption status as an absolute impenetrable federal shield. He was completely invisible to standard banking audits. "He is not invisible anymore," I stated flatly. "But the financial fraud is just the beginning of your massive federal indictment." My father recently lost $40 million of the syndicate's laundered money to a random overseas asset freeze. They gave him a strict lethal deadline to completely replace the missing funds. That is exactly why he is aggressively coming after my grandfather's $150 million estate this morning. He desperately needs my legitimate inheritance to pay off his massive underground debt before the cartel physically executes him. Sterling looked up from the glowing screen, his expression hardening into absolute professional concrete. He is utilizing corrupt municipal judges and bribing local sheriff deputies to force an illegal eviction. He summarized perfectly, processing the extreme tactical danger of the immediate situation. If he successfully secures those property deeds today, he will immediately liquidate the physical assets to the cartel, and the money will completely vanish overseas by midnight. I nodded slowly. But that is still not the worst part of this massive conspiracy, Sterling. I reached into the protective foam of the Pelican case and pulled out the small secondary flash drive. I plugged it directly into the secure terminal and opened the highly encrypted insurance folder. "I need you to watch this specific video file right now." I stepped back and allowed the veteran federal agent to watch the horrifying dashboard camera footage of my grandparents' final moments. I watched his face closely as the video played. Sterling was a highly seasoned investigator who had personally witnessed the absolute worst of human depravity, but even his jaw tightened visibly as my grandfather frantically pumped the sabotaged brakes. When the heavy luxury sedan violently crashed into the dark ravine and the video feed abruptly cut to static, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the sterile briefing room. "He intentionally cut the brake lines," Sterling whispered, his voice completely devoid of any professional detachment. "He murdered his own parents to accelerate the inheritance timeline so he could pay off his cartel debts." "Yes," I replied, my voice as cold and hard as solid ice. "I have the canceled luxury dealership maintenance records and the digital wire transfer receipt, proving he paid $25,000 to a shady syndicate mechanic the exact day before the fatal crash. This is no longer just a sophisticated white-collar financial crime. This is a premeditated double capital homicide committed in direct furtherance of a massive criminal conspiracy." Sterling immediately picked up his secure desk phone and dialed a direct line to the United States Attorney. He spoke rapidly and aggressively into the receiver, outlining the massive, undeniable physical evidence sitting right in front of him. He demanded immediate federal arrest warrants for Pastor Thomas, First Lady Denise Darius, and the corrupt branch manager at the local bank. He also requested a specialized federal tactical unit to be immediately dispatched to my exact location. While he coordinated the massive federal strike force, I pulled a prepared legal document from my leather briefcase and slid it across the metal table. "Before your tactical teams breach my property, Sterling, we need to finalize our official agreement. I am handing you the absolute biggest federal conviction of your entire career on a massive silver platter. I am giving you the complete syndicate ledger, the corrupt church financial records, and the undeniable murder weapon. But I demand absolute full immunity for my grandfather's legitimate commercial estate." Sterling hung up the secure phone and looked down at my legal document. "You want a preemptive federal asset protection order?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I want an absolute ironclad guarantee," I corrected him sharply. "I have meticulously traced every single penny of my grandfather's $150 million logistics empire. I can forensically prove beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt that his money is entirely clean and completely segregated from my father's highly illegal money laundering operation. When the federal government formally seizes the massive megachurch and freezes all of my parents' fraudulent assets, I need your absolute signed guarantee that the IRS will not attempt to maliciously entangle my grandfather's legitimate business empire in the massive upcoming civil forfeiture sweeps." Sterling picked up a black pen and carefully reviewed the forensic financial summaries I had attached to the legal agreement. "You did the math perfectly, Maya," he said, his voice filled with genuine professional respect. "You separated the dirty syndicate money from the clean logistics revenue with absolute surgical precision. You are protecting your family legacy while simultaneously handing the federal government the entire corrupt syndicate." He signed his name boldly at the bottom of the Federal Asset Protection Order and pushed the official document back across the table. "The estate is completely immune. Now let us talk about the tactical execution." Sterling unrolled a large digital map of the Riverside Villa and the surrounding private access roads. "Your father expects to arrive at your front door at exactly 8 o'clock this morning with his heavily corrupted local sheriff deputies. He thinks he owns the entire legal playing field. We are going to let him believe he is completely winning right up until the very last possible second." "Why wait?" I asked, crossing my arms over my chest. "Why not just arrest him right now at his massive suburban mansion?" "Because we need to catch the corrupt local law enforcement officers actively engaging in the illegal eviction process," Sterling explained, with a dangerous, predatory smile. "If we grab Pastor Thomas at his house, the corrupt municipal judge and the bribed sheriff deputies will immediately panic and aggressively destroy all their internal communication records. But if we let them physically execute this fraudulent eviction order on your private property, we catch the entire corrupt municipal network actively participating in a massive federal conspiracy. My tactical teams are already quietly staging in the dense woods surrounding your massive estate. We will remain completely invisible. We want Thomas to step out of his luxury car, feeling like an absolute untouchable king. We want him to publicly declare his total victory right in front of the local deputies. And the exact second he tries to forcefully breach your front door, we drop the massive federal hammer on his head." I nodded slowly, completely visualizing the upcoming tactical trap. It was an absolutely perfect strategy. My father had spent his entire pathetic life desperately craving public theatrical moments to showcase his massive artificial power. It was only fitting that his ultimate destruction would be a massive, highly public spectacle. "I need you to go exactly back to the Riverside Villa right now," Maya Sterling instructed, pointing at the digital map. "You need to be standing directly inside that grand foyer when they arrive. Do not show any fear. Do not try to physically fight them. Just hold your ground and let the arrogant bastards dig their own massive graves." "I will be ready," I promised, taking the signed immunity agreement and carefully packing it away in my leather briefcase. I left the covert federal field office and drove quickly back to the Riverside property. The sky was beginning to slowly lighten, turning from a deep bruised purple into a pale, icy blue. The heavy Maryland fog that had aggressively blanketed the river all night was finally starting to burn off. I unlocked the heavy wrought iron front gates and parked my car quietly in the garage. I walked into the quiet, empty house and systematically locked every single exterior door. I went upstairs and took a fast, scalding hot shower, washing away the cold sweat and the dark, lingering tension of the long, terrifying night. I changed into a sharp, tailored, charcoal gray corporate suit and paired it with simple, elegant black heels. I tied my hair back into a tight, severe professional bun. I looked directly into the bathroom mirror and saw exactly what I needed to see. I was no longer the frightened, estranged daughter. I was the absolute architect of their imminent destruction. I walked downstairs and stood quietly in the center of the grand foyer, looking up at the beautiful antique crystal chandelier. I checked the heavy gold watch on my wrist. It was 7:45 in the morning. The massive, quiet house felt incredibly tense, almost as if the historic wooden walls were actively holding their breath, waiting for the explosive violence to arrive. I held my digital tablet in my left hand, monitoring the high-definition exterior security cameras. I could see nothing but the long, winding gravel driveway and the tall, ancient willow trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. There was no visible sign of the heavily armed federal tactical teams that Sterling had promised. They were absolute professional ghosts blending perfectly into the dense surrounding forest. The grandfather clock in the corner of the study began to slowly chime, marking the impending 8 o'clock hour. I stood perfectly still, my posture completely rigid, and my heartbeat incredibly slow and steady. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was patiently waiting inside the heavy iron doors. Dawn officially broke, casting long, sharp golden shadows across the polished marble floor. Then the absolute silence of the quiet morning was suddenly and violently shattered. The loud, aggressive sound of heavy tires aggressively crunching on the long gravel driveway echoed loudly toward the house. I looked down at the glowing screen of my security tablet. A massive procession of highly expensive luxury vehicles, led directly by two fully marked county sheriff cruisers, was rolling aggressively through my front gates. The family had officially arrived for the eviction. The two fully marked county sheriff cruisers aggressively parked at an angle, completely blocking the circular driveway, as if they were conducting a major tactical raid on a dangerous drug cartel. Their red and blue emergency lights flashed brightly, reflecting off the pristine glass of the conservatory windows and casting harsh, colorful shadows across the manicured front lawn. Immediately behind the police cruisers, my father's massive custom black Rolls-Royce glided to a smooth halt. Bringing up the rear of the highly theatrical motorcade was the familiar white Mercedes G-Wagon, driven by my brother-in-law Darius. He had miraculously recovered his fake arrogant bravado from the humiliating midnight home invasion. They wanted this massive, highly visible spectacle to serve as a brutal, terrifying warning to anyone in the county who ever dared to challenge the absolute supreme authority of Pastor Thomas. The heavy doors of the luxury vehicles opened in unison. My father stepped out of the Rolls-Royce, first planting his polished Italian leather shoes firmly onto the gravel. He wore a brand-new, immaculate, tailored navy blue Armani suit, completely unbothered by the crisp morning air. He aggressively buttoned his jacket and stood incredibly tall, pushing his chest forward like a victorious Roman general returning from a successful military conquest. He actually paused for a brief second, adjusting his heavy gold Rolex to ensure it caught the morning sunlight perfectly. From the passenger side, my mother, First Lady Denise, emerged, gripping her counterfeit dark green Hermes Birkin bag tightly against her chest. She had dressed specifically for a tragic public performance, wearing a somber, highly expensive dark gray designer dress and oversized black sunglasses to completely hide her entirely tearless eyes. Chloe and Darius stepped out of their leased SUV looking incredibly smug and highly entitled. Chloe was practically bouncing on her expensive designer heels, holding her phone up and actively recording the entire scene for her private social media circles. She genuinely thought she was about to document the absolute most humiliating moment of my entire life. Darius stood closely behind her, aggressively crossing his arms over his chest, trying desperately to look tough and intimidating. He clearly believed that hiding behind the physical presence of the armed municipal police officers entirely erased his pathetic whimpering and begging from just a few hours ago. He looked up at the grand sweeping architecture of the riverside villa with undisguised overwhelming greed, clearly calculating exactly how quickly he could liquidate the massive property to pay off his lethal cartel debts. Two heavily armed local municipal sheriff deputies stepped out of their flashing cruisers. They did not look like standard public servants arriving to execute a routine civil eviction. They swaggered aggressively up the gravel driveway, resting their hands heavily on their duty belts, right next to their sidearms. Their uniform shirts were stretched tight, and they both wore dark mirrored aviator sunglasses reflecting the massive luxury estate back at me. I recognized the older deputy immediately. His name was Officer Miller, and he moonlighted every single Sunday as the head of the private security detail at my father's massive megachurch. He was explicitly on my father's illegal payroll, receiving envelopes of untaxed laundered cash to ensure the church and its highly corrupt leadership remained entirely untouchable by standard municipal law enforcement. The loud, aggressive commotion of the flashing police lights and the slamming car doors inevitably drew the immediate attention of the wealthy surrounding neighbors. Doors opened and people stepped out onto their massive manicured lawns and sweeping front porches, gripping their morning coffee mugs. This neighborhood was deeply populated by established old money families who had deeply respected my hard-working grandparents for decades. My father was incredibly hyper-aware of the growing local audience. He completely thrived on this exact type of public attention. He immediately recognized the strategic necessity of controlling the absolute public narrative before I could even speak a single word in my own defense. My father gave a subtle, sharp nod to my mother. Denise instantly activated her flawless theatrical performance. She dropped her heavy counterfeit Hermes bag directly onto the gravel and dramatically covered her mouth with both of her hands, letting out a loud, piercing wail of pure artificial agony. "Oh, my poor sweet baby girl," she cried loudly, making absolute certain her voice carried clearly across the large, sprawling lawns to the watching neighbors. She leaned heavily against my father's solid shoulder, pretending her legs were entirely too weak to physically support her own body weight. "She has completely lost her fragile mind, Thomas. She is having a severe, terrifying psychotic break. We have to violently force her out of that beautiful historic house before she physically destroys her own grandfather's sacred legacy." My father wrapped a protective, comforting arm around her shoulders, expertly playing the role of the incredibly stoic, grieving patriarch forced to make an impossibly difficult family decision. "I know, Denise," he projected his deep, booming baritone voice, carrying effortlessly through the crisp morning air. "It absolutely breaks my heavy heart to involve the local authorities in a private, tragic family matter. But Maya has become entirely unpredictable and highly dangerous to herself and to others. She maliciously manipulated my poor dying parents into signing those fraudulent legal documents, and now she is aggressively squatting in their historic home. We must secure the physical property for her own strict mental safety and for the ultimate legal integrity of the massive estate. She desperately needs to be immediately institutionalized and placed under heavy psychiatric observation." I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand foyer, gripping my encrypted digital tablet, watching their disgusting artificial performance play out in glorious high definition on the security cameras. Their pure, unadulterated sociopathic audacity was genuinely breathtaking. They were standing on the exact driveway where my grandfather Silas used to patiently teach me how to properly ride a bicycle, and they were aggressively screaming absolute filthy lies to the entire wealthy neighborhood. They were actively utilizing a highly weaponized false narrative of severe mental illness to publicly justify an illegal armed assault on my private property. They wanted the influential watching neighbors to genuinely believe they were witnessing a tragic, necessary medical intervention rather than a massive, desperate corporate heist organized by a violent federal money launderer. Chloe stepped forward, joining the fake, tragic public circus. She wiped an imaginary tear from her cheek while continuing to actively record the entire scene with her smartphone. "We tried so incredibly hard to help her," she yelled toward a group of neighbors standing near the property line. "We offered her absolute, complete forgiveness and a massive, generous financial settlement just yesterday morning. But she completely snapped. She is aggressively stealing from our own family. She is entirely out of her mind." Darius just stood there nodding solemnly, attempting to look deeply concerned. The irony of a man who had literally broken through my glass conservatory window with armed cartel thugs just 6 hours ago, now standing in the bright morning sunlight pretending to be a concerned, righteous family member, was absolutely nauseating. My father finally turned his complete attention away from the captivated watching neighbors and focused directly on the massive, heavy wrought iron front doors of the villa. He squared his broad shoulders and marched confidently up the wide brick steps leading to the expansive front porch. He was flanked tightly on both sides by the two heavily armed corrupt sheriff deputies. Officer Miller stepped forward, unhooking the heavy metal clasp on his standard-issue baton. He aggressively pounded his heavy fist against the thick, dark wood and iron of the front door. The loud, sharp banging echoed violently through the quiet interior of the grand foyer. "Maya Vance," Officer Miller shouted, his gruff, aggressive voice attempting to project absolute supreme legal authority. "This is the county sheriff's department. We have a highly urgent, legally binding judicial order explicitly demanding your immediate physical eviction from these specific premises. You are officially ordered to open this front door immediately and completely surrender your physical person to municipal custody. If you blatantly refuse to comply with this direct, lawful order, we are fully authorized by the sitting county judge to aggressively breach this heavy door and forcefully extract you using whatever physical force is deemed absolutely necessary." My father stood right behind the aggressive deputy, a deeply malicious, arrogant smile spreading slowly across his face. He leaned slightly forward, raising his voice so it would easily penetrate the thick, heavy doors. "It is completely over, Maya. he gloated, his tone dripping with intense, toxic superiority. You played a highly dangerous, stupid game and you lost absolutely everything. I told you that you would never survive a single week in this massive house. Now I am giving you exactly 10 seconds to unlock that heavy door and walk out here on your knees. If you force these highly trained municipal officers to kick this expensive door in, they are going to aggressively drag you out by your hair, and I will personally ensure you spend the next 10 years rotting in a tiny, miserable county jail cell for severe felony elder abuse. He paused, savoring the incredible heavy tension of the moment. 10, he started loudly counting down for the benefit of the watching neighbors. 9, 8. Denise resumed her loud, dramatic wailing, burying her face deeply into her counterfeit Hermes bag. Chloe held her smartphone higher, eagerly anticipating the violent, chaotic physical breach. Darius cracked his knuckles, grinning widely. They genuinely, completely believed they had absolutely won. They truly thought they had entirely cornered the weak, helpless, estranged daughter and were about to successfully steal a $150 million logistical empire right out from under my nose to pay off their massive, violent cartel debts. 7. My father continued, his deep voice booming confidently across the large, sweeping porch. 6. 5. Break the heavy door down, Miller. Do not wait for her to desperately scramble away. Aggressively kick it completely open right now. Officer Miller eagerly stepped back, creating a generous amount of physical space on the wide brick porch. He raised his heavy tactical boot, fully preparing to launch a massive violent kick directly at the center-locking mechanism of the thick antique iron door. He intended to completely shatter the historic wood and aggressively swarm the grand foyer, with his hand resting dangerously close to his loaded sidearm. But I was absolutely done waiting. I did not give the corrupt, arrogant deputy the incredible satisfaction of physically striking my grandfather's beautiful historic home. I reached forward with my free hand and firmly grasped the heavy, ornate brass handle. Just as Officer Miller aggressively shifted his entire massive body weight forward to completely demolish the lock, I smoothly and rapidly turned the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door backward. The massive, heavy oak and iron doors of the grand villa swung open incredibly gracefully and entirely silently on their perfectly oiled brass hinges. They completely opened wide a full critical second before the aggressive, corrupt deputies could even physically touch them. The sudden, complete absence of the heavy physical barrier severely threw Officer Miller entirely off balance, causing him to stumble awkwardly and clumsily forward onto the polished interior marble floor of the foyer. I stepped smoothly out of the dark interior shadows and directly into the bright, crisp morning sunlight. I was absolutely perfectly composed, standing incredibly tall in my sharp-tailored charcoal gray corporate suit. My hair was pulled back tightly, my posture was entirely rigid, and my face was a completely unreadable mask of cold, lethal forensic calculation. I held my encrypted digital tablet loosely in my left hand. I looked directly past the stumbling, corrupt deputies, completely ignoring my fake sobbing mother and my aggressively recording sister. I locked my eyes strictly on my father, Pastor Thomas, watching the malicious, arrogant smirk instantly freeze and rapidly begin to die on his extremely confident face. Thomas blinked rapidly, his heavily gelled hair shifting slightly as he took an involuntary step back. The heavy wrought iron door had completely vanished from his path, leaving him staring directly into my cold, calculating eyes. He quickly composed himself aggressively, shaking off the brief moment of absolute surprise. He stood up completely straight, expanding his broad chest and extending his open right hand directly toward my face. "Hand over the keys right now, Maya," he ordered, his voice a harsh, demanding bark, designed to immediately assert total physical dominance. "You finally made the single intelligent decision of your entire life. Step aside and let the municipal officers escort you quietly to the waiting patrol car. We can avoid the ugly physical violence if you just completely surrender the physical property deeds right this second." I did not look at his extended hand. I kept my eyes locked entirely on his face. I smiled a cold, entirely humorless smile that did not reach my eyes. "You are standing on private property, Thomas," I stated, my voice perfectly measured, carrying the sharp, unmistakable edge of absolute authority. My father let out a loud, incredibly patronizing laugh that echoed sharply across the wide brick porch and traveled across the perfectly manicured lawn. Private property, he mocked, shaking his head in deep theatrical disbelief for the benefit of the watching neighbors. Did you not read the official legal documents the process server handed you this morning, you foolish, arrogant girl? You do not own a single square inch of this riverside estate anymore. Judge Harold Montgomery legally transferred the temporary physical custody of this entire property directly to me. I have the official municipal court order securely in my pocket. You are currently trespassing in my house. He turned aggressively toward the two corrupt local sheriff deputies. Officer Miller, arrest this trespassing criminal immediately, he commanded, his face flushing red with raw, unfiltered anger. Put her in heavy metal handcuffs and physically drag her down the front steps. I want her completely removed from my sight right now. Officer Miller eagerly stepped forward, his hand aggressively reaching for the heavy metal cuffs clipped to his utility belt. He genuinely thought he was about to physically assault an unarmed, defenseless woman to earn his illicit weekly envelope of laundered church cash. Chloe pushed her way to the front of the group, holding her smartphone completely steady, eagerly anticipating the violent physical takedown. Darius smirked, leaning heavily against the porch railing, waiting for my absolute humiliation to finally satisfy his deeply bruised ego. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply held my ground and looked at the corrupt local deputy with a look of pure, lethal pity. I shifted my piercing gaze back to my father. You are entirely right, Dad, I said, my voice slicing through the crisp morning air like a newly sharpened surgical blade. You have the corrupt local judge securely in your deep pockets. You have the bribed municipal sheriff deputies standing right next to you on my front porch. You even have the wealthy neighborhood watching your fake, tragic public performance. I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch for a fraction of a second, ensuring every single person on the lawn could hear my next exact words. But you do not have the feds. I took one single deliberate step backward and smoothly pivoted to my right, completely clearing the grand entryway of the massive historic villa. From the dark interior shadows of the grand foyer, Special Agent Sterling stepped smoothly into the bright morning sunlight. He did not look anything like a local municipal cop. He wore a heavy dark tactical vest with the bold yellow letters IRSCI emblazoned massively across his chest. He held his gold federal badge up high, reflecting the bright morning sun directly into my father's rapidly paling face. At that exact precise moment, the dense, beautifully manicured garden hedges surrounding the sweeping front porch suddenly erupted with coordinated tactical movement. 6 massive, heavily armed federal agents emerged completely silently from their concealed positions in the bushes and around the corners of the historic estate. They were dressed in full dark tactical combat gear, carrying suppressed automatic rifles and wearing heavy ballistic helmets. They moved with terrifying, lethal military precision, instantly forming a highly secure physical perimeter around the entire front porch. They immediately aimed their red laser sights directly at the center mass of the 2 corrupt municipal sheriff deputies. Drop your hands entirely away from your weapons right now, a federal tactical agent barked from the garden, his voice carrying the absolute, unquestionable authority of the United States government. Officer Miller froze completely, his hand hovering mere inches above his standard-issue sidearm. He looked at the massive federal tactical team aggressively surrounding him and immediately recognized the absolute terrifying reality of his immediate situation. He was a highly corrupt local cop entirely accustomed to intimidating unarmed suburban civilians and collecting dirty cash in dark church parking lots. He was entirely out of his depth facing elite, heavily armed federal investigators. Officer Miller and his corrupt partner instantly raised both of their hands high into the air, taking several rapid steps backward, completely abandoning my father on the front porch. They surrendered without speaking a single syllable. My father's confident, arrogant smirk completely evaporated instantly, replaced by a look of absolute sheer, visceral terror. The heavy, confident blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His expensive custom Armani suit suddenly looked incredibly loose and entirely ridiculous on his violently trembling frame. He looked frantically around the yard, realizing the local police he had entirely bought and paid for were currently cowering against the brick columns with their hands raised in total surrender. Chloe lowered her smartphone, her mouth hanging completely open in silent, absolute shock. The bright screen of her phone was still actively recording, capturing the exact, devastating moment her entire fake wealthy lifestyle violently imploded. Darius actually stumbled backward, tripping over his own expensive designer sneakers and crashing hard into the thick wooden porch railing. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic because he knew exactly what the presence of federal financial investigators meant for his massive, lethal cartel debts. The fake, tragic wailing completely stopped as my mother, First Lady Denise, lowered her counterfeit Hermes bag, staring at the heavily armed federal agents in total horrified disbelief. The massive theatrical public performance was officially and permanently over. Special Agent Sterling stepped fully onto the wide brick porch, completely closing the physical distance between himself and my terrified father. He did not yell. He did not need to raise his voice. His cold, professional tone carried the massive, crushing weight of a permanent federal indictment. Pastor Thomas Sterling announced, his voice echoing clearly across the perfectly silent, manicured lawn, reaching the ears of every single wealthy neighbor who had stepped outside to watch the morning spectacle. You currently owe the Internal Revenue Service exactly $40 million in unpaid taxes derived entirely from illegal criminal enterprises. The federal agent reached into his heavy tactical vest and pulled out a thick stack of official federal arrest warrants bearing the supreme seal of the United States Federal Court. My father tried to open his mouth to speak, to loudly deploy his standard religious manipulation tactics or claim intense spiritual persecution, but his throat was entirely paralyzed with raw fear. But the massive tax evasion is frankly the absolute least of your immediate problems. Thomas Sterling continued, his sharp eyes locking directly onto my father's trembling face. I am placing you under immediate federal arrest for massive international wire fraud, operating an illegal continuous money laundering syndicate, and aggressive corporate racketeering. Sterling paused, letting the heavy, terrifying list of severe financial felonies sink deeply into the minds of the horrified watching neighbors. The wealthy residents who had generously donated millions of dollars to the megachurch building fund were now listening to a federal agent publicly confirm that their trusted pastor was actually a high-level criminal money launderer. Then Sterling delivered the absolute lethal crushing blow exactly as we had carefully planned it. And based on highly secure encrypted digital evidence acquired early this morning, we are officially adding the federal charge of premeditated conspiracy to commit capital murder. You have the right to remain silent. The absolute horrific reality of the word murder hung heavily in the crisp morning air, dropping onto the front porch like a massive unexploded bomb. The financial crimes had shocked the family, but the explicit federal accusation of capital murder completely destroyed them. My father physically collapsed, falling entirely to his knees on the hard brick porch. His polished Italian leather shoes scraped uselessly against the stone. He could not breathe. He could not speak a single word of defense. The massive, untouchable religious empire he had spent 30 years maliciously building had just been completely, instantly vaporized in front of his entire wealthy neighborhood. He stared blankly at the brick floor, his massive, narcissistic ego entirely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Behind him, First Lady Denise let out a sound that was entirely different from her previous fake theatrical wailing. It was a raw, visceral, terrifying scream of absolute, pure, genuine panic. She screamed as two massive federal tactical agents aggressively moved past the trembling local deputies and firmly grabbed my father, dragging his arms violently behind his back to apply the heavy steel federal handcuffs. The click of heavy steel federal handcuffs locking securely around my father's wrists acted as the final catalyst for panic. The illusion of their religious empire shattered into pieces on the brick porch. Darius watched the agents subdue the pastor, and his primal survival instincts took over. He spun around, kicking up loose gravel, and sprinted desperately toward the open door of his white Mercedes G-Wagon. He thought he could outrun a federal raid. He did not make it 5 steps. Two agents in dark tactical gear lunged forward, clearing the stone steps in a single bound. They hit Darius simultaneously, driving their shoulders into his lower back with devastating force. The three men crashed violently onto the hard gravel driveway. Darius let out a shriek of agony as the agents pinned his arms behind his back and forcefully applied their own steel restraints. His fake Rolex shattered against a rock, sending tiny pieces of glass scattering across the driveway. My mother, Denise, lost whatever remaining fraction of sanity she still possessed. Her knees buckled, giving way beneath her expensive designer dress. She collapsed onto the rough brick porch, her counterfeit Hermes bag tumbling out of her manicured hands, spilling expensive cosmetics across the hard stone. The sudden impact caused her perfectly styled dark wig to shift awkwardly backward, exposing the pale edge of her natural hairline and destroying her carefully cultivated public image. She scrambled frantically on her hands and knees, reaching out toward the two corrupt municipal sheriff deputies standing completely frozen near the tall porch columns. "Officer Miller, do something," she shrieked, her voice a raw screech of pure desperation. "You are the local police. You have absolute municipal jurisdiction here. You cannot let these federal thugs kidnap the holy pastor of your church. Shoot them right now. Arrest them. Do your job and protect your spiritual leader." But Officer Miller and his corrupt partner did not move a single inch. They kept their hands raised high in the universal gesture of surrender, pressing their backs firmly against the brick walls of my estate. They were staring directly down the hollow barrels of 4 suppressed federal automatic rifles. They were terrified, realizing their illicit envelopes of laundered church cash would inevitably be scrutinized in the massive upcoming federal investigation. They backed away from my screaming mother, shaking their heads in total cowardice, entirely abandoning the very people who had illegally paid their salaries for years. Chloe remained completely frozen on the manicured lawn, paralyzed by the massive explosive violence unfolding all around her. The expensive smartphone she had been eagerly using to aggressively record my public humiliation slipped through her trembling fingers, dropping heavily onto the gravel and cracking the bright digital screen. She stared blankly at her husband, pinned face down in the dirt, and then looked at her powerful father, currently kneeling helplessly in heavy federal chains. My father. Pastor Thomas struggled against the tight steel cuffs, severely cutting his own wrists against the sharp, unforgiving metal. A federal agent firmly grasped the thick collar of his custom navy blue Armani suit, hauling him up from his knees and forcing him to stand completely upright. Thomas looked wildly around the massive estate, desperately searching for any possible remaining avenue of escape or manipulation. His wild, panicked eyes finally locked directly onto my calm, unreadable face. The heavy, arrogant mask of the powerful, untouchable mega-church patriarch was completely gone. He was just a terrified, desperate old man entirely cornered by the devastating consequences of his own horrific, lethal actions. "Maya, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a loud, highly desperate sob. The loud, booming baritone voice he had proudly used to aggressively manipulate faithful congregants was reduced to a miserable, desperate whine. He aggressively pulled against the heavy grip of the federal agent, trying desperately to step closer to me. "You cannot let them do this to me, Maya. I am your own father. We share the exact same family name. You have the massive estate now. You have the $150 million. You can easily hire the absolute best criminal defense attorneys in the entire country. You can completely fix this massive misunderstanding. Please, Maya. You cannot just stand there and let them completely destroy your own blood." I looked at the pathetic, desperate man standing in federal chains. I did not feel a single microscopic drop of sadness or familial loyalty. I slowly lifted my secure, encrypted smartphone from my pocket. I calmly dialed the direct international number for my offshore trust administrator and firmly pressed the bright speakerphone icon. The loud, clear ringing tone echoed sharply across the quiet porch, entirely cutting through my mother's frantic sobbing and Darius' muffled, gravelly screams. A crisp, professional voice immediately answered the secure international line. "Account administrator speaking. How may I assist you today, Ms. Vance?" I maintained absolute, direct, unblinking eye contact with my terrified father as I spoke clearly into the digital microphone. This is my advance. I stated, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. I am calling to officially authorize the immediate, irrevocable transfer of the entire $150 million liquid balance directly into the blind, untouchable offshore trust. The financial administrator typed rapidly on his keyboard. Transfer completely authorized and legally executed, Ms. Vance, the professional voice, confirmed. No, that will be absolutely all, I replied, and firmly tapped the red disconnect button. My father stared at me in absolute, complete, horrified silence. He instantly realized what I had just done. I stepped slowly forward, closing the physical distance between us. I am not your blood, Thomas. I said, my voice as incredibly cold and sharp as pure solid ice. I am the forensic accountant who just completely audited your entire pathetic, fraudulent life. I turned my back completely on his terrified screaming and walked smoothly through the grand foyer, pulling the heavy oak doors entirely shut and firmly locking the solid deadbolt behind me.